This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I'd made this walk hundreds of times before, but something felt off that night. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. I quickened my pace slightly, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it, footsteps behind me, matching my rhythm exactly. I glanced back over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. About half a block back, I saw a figure in a dark hoodie, head down, walking in the same direction. Okay, no big deal, I thought. Probably just someone else heading home after a late night. But the prickling sensation of unease wouldn't leave me. I decided to test my suspicion. At the next intersection, instead of continuing straight as usual, I made a sharp right turn. The footsteps behind me hesitated for just a moment, then followed. My heart started to pound. This was no coincidence. I was being followed. I picked up my pace, power walking now. The footsteps behind me quickened to match. I made another turn, this time left, deviating further from my usual route home. Again, the follower mirrored my movements. Panic started to set in. Who was this person? What did they want? I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'2" and work out regularly. But the thought of confronting this shadow in the night filled me with dread. I spotted a 24-hour convenience store up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon of safety. I hurried inside, the bell above the door jingling as I entered. The bored-looking clerk barely glanced up from his phone. I pretended to browse the snack aisle while watching the door. After a minute, I saw the hooded figure pass by slowly, peering inside. My blood ran cold as I caught a glimpse of their face in the glow of the storefront. Pale, gaunt features and dark, sunken eyes. They locked eyes with me for just a moment before continuing past. I waited another 5 minutes in the store, my heart hammering in my chest. When I cautiously stepped back outside, the street appeared empty. Had they given up? I power-walked the last few blocks to my apartment building, constantly looking over my shoulder. Just as I reached for the door, movement in my peripheral vision made me whirl around. The hooded figure was across the street, standing perfectly still, staring directly at me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. I slammed it behind me and ran up the 4 flights of stairs to my unit, not wanting to wait for the elevator. Once inside, I locked and chained the door, then sank to the floor, gasping for breath. What the hell had just happened? Who was that person, and why were they following me? I crawled over to the window and peeked out through the blinds. The hooded figure was gone. Had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the events in my mind, second-guessing every detail. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe I was overreacting to nothing. But deep down, I knew what I'd experienced was real. The methodical way they'd followed my every move. That haunting face in the convenience store window. The final image of them standing across from my building, watching. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face going outside. I spent the day huddled in my apartment, jumping at every little noise. That evening, my curiosity finally overcame my fear. I had to know if they were still out there. I crept to the window and peered out. My heart nearly stopped. There, on the opposite sidewalk, stood the hooded figure, waiting, watching. I scrambled away from the window in horror. This couldn't be happening. Why me? What did this person want? I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless the person actually tried to break in or attack me. Following someone on public streets wasn't technically illegal. For the next week, I only left my apartment when absolutely necessary. Each time, no matter what hour I went out, I'd spot the hooded figure, sometimes across the street, sometimes half a block behind, always watching, always following. I became a nervous wreck. I couldn't sleep. I barely ate. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. I tried changing up my schedule, leaving at different times. It didn't matter. They were always there. I even tried taking a taxi to throw them off. But when I got out at my destination, there they were, waiting. How were they doing this? It was like they could predict my movements before I even made them. After 2 weeks of this psychological torture, I'd had enough. I decided to confront my stalker. The next time I left my building and spotted them, I marched directly across the street towards them. They didn't move or try to run. As I got closer, I could make out more details. The dark circles under their eyes, the sallow, almost grayish skin, the blank, emotionless stare. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Why are you following me?" They said nothing, just continued to stare. "Answer me," I shouted, grabbing the front of their hoodie. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Up close, I could see that their eyes weren't just dark, they were completely black. No whites, no irises, just endless, bottomless black. I stumbled backward in shock. The hooded figure's mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, door locked and barricaded with a chair. What was that thing? It couldn't be human. The eyes, the teeth. It was like something out of a nightmare. I spent the next 3 days holed up in my apartment, not daring to so much as look out the window. I was afraid of what I might see. On the 4th day, when I finally worked up the courage to peer outside, the street was empty. No hooded figure, no one watching. I waited another day, then cautiously ventured out. Nothing. No sign of my stalker. It's been a month now, and I haven't seen them since. But I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, waiting, watching. I don't know what that thing was or what it wanted. I don't know why it chose me or why it suddenly stopped. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget those black eyes and those razor-sharp teeth. Sometimes at night, I still hear phantom footsteps echoing my own. And every time I leave my apartment, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that hooded figure following me once again. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in this city again. The experience has left me permanently on edge, always watching, always waiting for those footsteps to return. If you're reading this, be careful out there. You never know who or what might be following you in the shadows. And if you ever find yourself being stalked by a figure in a dark hoodie, don't confront them. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because what's under that hood might be far worse than anything you could imagine. I was so excited when we first moved into our new house in the suburbs. After years of cramped apartment living, it felt like a dream come true to have a spacious home with a big backyard for our daughter Lily to play in. The neighborhood seemed picture-perfect too, quiet streets lined with well-kept homes, friendly faces waving as they walked their dogs or mowed their lawns. Everything was going great for the first few weeks. We were settling in nicely, unpacking boxes and starting to make the place feel like home. Lily was thrilled to have her own room to decorate, and my husband and I loved having a proper kitchen to cook in. The neighbors all seemed welcoming, stopping by to introduce themselves and bring over baked goods or small housewarming gifts. That's how we first met Chris, who lived in the house next door with his wife. He seemed nice enough at first, a bit loud and boisterous maybe, but friendly. He came over one Saturday afternoon as we were doing yard work, introducing himself and chatting for a while. I remember thinking he was a little overly familiar for someone we'd just met, standing a bit too close and making lots of intense eye contact. But I brushed it off as just an outgoing personality. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that things started to feel off. I was scrolling through Facebook one evening when I got a friend request from Chris. I thought it was a little odd to friend request your new neighbors online, but figured it was harmless enough and accepted. Almost immediately, he started liking and commenting on nearly all of my posts, especially any photos I shared of Lily. The comments weren't overtly inappropriate, just things like, "What a cutie," or "She's getting so big," but the sheer volume felt unsettling. Around the same time, I started noticing Chris outside a lot more when Lily was playing in the yard after school. He always seemed to have a reason to be out front, checking the mail, washing his car, doing yard work, and he'd always make a point of calling out to say hi and try to strike up a conversation, asking Lily lots of questions about school and her friends. It made me uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. Then one day, Lily came inside looking uncomfortable. When I asked what was wrong, she said Chris had been talking to her over the fence and made a comment about how pretty she was getting and how she'd be breaking boys' hearts soon. She was only 11 at the time. A chill ran down my spine hearing that, but I didn't want to scare Lily, so I just told her to come inside if Chris ever made her feel weird again. I mentioned it to my husband that night, and he agreed it was concerning. We decided to start limiting Lily's time playing outside unsupervised, but things only escalated from there. Chris seemed to always know when Lily got home from school and would coincidentally be outside at the same time. He started offering her rides home if he saw her walking down the street. Thankfully, she always refused, but it was clear he was going out of his way to interact with her. The final straw came about a month after we'd moved in. I was cleaning up after dinner one night when I glanced out the kitchen window and saw a shadowy figure near Lily's bedroom window. My heart nearly stopped. I ran outside and found Chris standing there, claiming he'd seen a suspicious person and was just checking things out. But I knew he'd been trying to look in my daughter's window. Shaken and furious, I told Chris to leave immediately and stay away from our family. My husband and I spent a sleepless night discussing what to do. The next morning, we went to the police station to file a report. And that's when we found out the truth about our neighbor. It turned out Chris had a violent criminal record, including assault charges and a restraining order from an ex-girlfriend. He was a registered sex offender who wasn't supposed to be living within a certain distance of schools or playgrounds. Somehow he'd slipped through the cracks when moving to our neighborhood. The police took our concerns seriously and launched an investigation. In the process, they discovered Chris had been carrying on an affair, and his wife kicked him out when she found out. He'd been staying with a friend in another part of town for the past week, which explained why we hadn't seen him lately. Chris was ultimately arrested for violating the terms of his sex offender registration. Last I heard, he was facing jail time. His wife put their house up for sale and moved away. I'm so grateful nothing worse happened, but I still have nightmares about what could have been. We've since installed security cameras, and I'm much more cautious about who I let into our lives. Lily seems okay, but she's in therapy to process everything. I can't help but think about how easily this predator wormed his way into our neighborhood, how close he came to potentially harming my child. It's a parent's worst nightmare. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Trust your instincts, be vigilant, and never assume you really know someone just because they seem friendly. Evil can hide behind a charming smile and a well-kept lawn. Stay safe out there. I was just trying to put myself out there, you know. After a string of failed relationships and feeling lonely, I decided to give online dating a shot. Little did I know that swiping right on that seemingly normal profile would lead to weeks of harassment and fear. It all started innocently enough. I matched with this guy, let's call him Mark, on a popular dating app. His profile seemed decent. Nice photos, witty bio, similar interests. We started chatting, and he came across as funny and charming at first. After a few days of messaging back and forth, he suggested we meet up for coffee. I was hesitant, but figured a quick coffee date in a public place would be safe enough. We met at a local cafe on a Saturday afternoon. In person, Mark was reasonably attractive and initially seemed nice, if a bit intense. He asked a lot of questions about my life, job, family, etc. Looking back, I probably shared more personal details than I should have with a virtual stranger. The date itself was fine, but nothing special. I didn't feel any real spark or connection. When he suggested meeting up again soon, I politely declined and said I didn't think we were a good match. That's when things started to get weird. Over the next few days, Mark bombarded me with messages. At first, they were just pushy, asking why I didn't want to see him again, insisting we should give it another shot. I reiterated that I wasn't interested, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. The messages got increasingly frequent and aggressive in tone. Then came the inappropriate photos. I was at a family dinner when my phone buzzed. I discreetly checked it under the table, only to be greeted by an unsolicited explicit pic from Mark. I was mortified and quickly put my phone away, trying to hide my shock from my relatives. But the buzzing continued as he sent message after message. I excused myself to the bathroom and blocked his number, hoping that would be the end of it. But he just created new profiles to contact me from. At this point, I was getting seriously creeped out. I considered reporting him to the dating app, but worried about potential retaliation. A few days later, I was home alone watching TV when I got a message from an unknown number. Nice apartment complex. The blue door looks good. My blood ran cold. How did he know where I lived? I peeked out the window and saw a shadowy figure standing across the street, staring up at my building. Panicking, I called a friend to come over immediately. As I waited for her to arrive, more messages came through. I can see your bedroom light on. Why won't you talk to me? Come outside, I just want to chat. I was shaking uncontrollably, terrified he would try to break in. My friend arrived about 20 minutes later and insisted on calling the police. When they showed up, the guy was gone. The officers took a report, but said there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't actually done anything illegal. They suggested I stay with someone else for a few days, which I did. But even at my friend's place, the harassment continued online. Mark had somehow found all my social media profiles. He left creepy comments on old photos and posts. He seemed to know details about my life and schedule that I had never told him. Had he been stalking me online this whole time? I deactivated all my accounts and changed my phone number, but still felt on edge constantly. Every time I left the house, I was terrified I'd run into him. I started having nightmares about being followed and attacked. My work suffered as I struggled to focus through the stress and lack of sleep. After a couple weeks of radio silence, I started to think maybe it was finally over. I cautiously reactivated one social media account, thinking I was being paranoid. Big mistake. Within hours, Mark had found me again. This time, The messages were even more unhinged and threatening. He said things like, "You can't hide from me. We belong together and I'll make you see that. If I can't have you, no one will." I was genuinely afraid for my safety at this point. I went back to the police, but they still said their hands were tied without concrete evidence of a crime. I felt utterly helpless. This psycho knew where I lived, worked, hung out. He had access to so much of my personal information. I started researching how to completely erase my digital footprint, but it seemed impossible in this interconnected world. The final straw came about a month after our initial coffee date. I was walking to my car after work when I noticed something stuck under the windshield wiper. It was a handwritten note that said, "Soon." Just that one ominous word. I looked around frantically but didn't see anyone watching. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up some essentials and fled to stay with family in another state. I told my job I needed a leave of absence for a family emergency. I was too ashamed and scared to tell many people what was really going on. It's been a few months now, and things seem to have died down. But I'm still constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every notification on my phone. I'm seeing a therapist to work through the trauma and anxiety. I've installed security cameras at my new place and rarely go out alone anymore. The whole ordeal has completely changed how I view online interactions and dating. I'm much more guarded now about what I share online. I've sworn off dating apps entirely. The risk just isn't worth it to me anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted or if it was all just an elaborate prank. But then I remember the genuine fear I felt, the sleepless nights, the way my whole life was upended. No one should have to go through that just for politely rejecting someone after one mediocre date. I'm sharing this as a cautionary tale. Be careful what information you put out there. Trust your instincts if someone gives you a bad vibe. And don't be afraid to involve authorities if you feel unsafe, even if they can't do much right away. Document everything. I'm slowly rebuilding my life and trying to move past this, but the experience will stay with me forever. To anyone else who has dealt with this kind of harassment, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Stay safe out there, everyone. I was 21 when it happened. Just a normal Tuesday in January, heading home after my evening class at the community college downtown. The bitter winter wind whipped around me as I descended the steps into the subway station, my breath forming little clouds in the frigid air. I was exhausted and looking forward to getting home, warming up and crawling into bed. The platform was eerily quiet when I arrived. Usually at this time, around 9:30 p.m., there were at least a few other commuters waiting for the train. But tonight, I was alone. I pulled my coat tighter around me and shifted from foot to foot, trying to stay warm as I waited. Finally, the train arrived with a screech of metal on metal. I boarded quickly, relieved to be out of the cold. As we rattled through the dark tunnels, I noticed the car was nearly empty. Just me and an older woman dozing in the corner. I tried to shake off an uneasy feeling. It wasn't that unusual for the subway to be quiet on a weeknight in winter, I told myself. 20 minutes later, we pulled into my stop. I got off, my footsteps echoing in the deserted station. As I climbed the stairs to street level, a gust of icy wind hit me full in the face. I shivered and looked around. The streets were completely empty. No cars, no pedestrians, nothing. Just dark storefronts and swirling snow under the dim streetlights. A flicker of panic rose in my chest. Where was everyone? This area was usually bustling, even late at night. There were popular bars and restaurants just a block away. But now, it was like a ghost town. I pulled out my phone, thinking I should call an Uber. To my dismay, I saw I had no cell service. Of course, this neighborhood was notorious for bad reception. Swallowing hard, I decided to start walking. My apartment was only about 10 minutes away. I'd be fine. I'd gone about a block when I heard it, the soft whir of bicycle wheels on pavement behind me. I glanced back and saw a man on a bike, slowly pedaling in my direction. He was bundled up against the cold, a dark hat pulled low over his face. My heart started to race. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching in the light dusting of snow. The cyclist sped up too, getting closer. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out. His voice was rough, slurring slightly. "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here all alone?" I didn't respond, just walked faster. He was right beside me now, slowly circling on his bike. "Aw, come on, don't be like that," he said. "I'm just trying to be friendly. Why don't you let me give you a ride home?" He reached out as if to grab my arm. I jerked away, nearly slipping on a patch of ice. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm fine. I don't need a ride." He laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down my spine. "Don't be scared, baby. I just want to talk." I broke into a run, my bag bouncing against my hip, but the icy sidewalk was treacherous. I made it only a few steps before my feet went out from under me, and I crashed to the ground, pain shooting through my palms and knees. Before I could get up, he was there. He dropped his bike and crouched beside me, grabbing my shoulders. "Shh, it's okay," he said, his alcohol-laced breath hot on my face. "I've got you." I struggled, trying to push him away, but he was much stronger. He wrapped his arms around me in a bear hug, pinning my arms to my sides. I could feel the rough stubble of his cheek as he pressed his face against mine. "Just one little kiss," he mumbled. "Come on, don't fight it." Tears were streaming down my face now. I thrashed wildly, trying to kick him, to scream, anything. But it felt like my throat had closed up in terror. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to me. And then suddenly, miraculously, I heard another voice. "Hey, what's going on here?" The man loosened his grip, startled. I wrenched free and scrambled backward, looking up to see another cyclist approaching fast. As he got closer, I saw with overwhelming relief that he was wearing a police uniform. My attacker swore and leapt to his feet, grabbing his bike. But the officer was faster, cutting him off before he could flee. "Don't move," the cop ordered, his hand on his weapon. To me, he said gently, "Are you all right, miss? Did he hurt you?" I shook my head, still too shaken to speak. The officer called for backup on his radio, keeping his eyes on the other man the whole time. It was all a blur after that. More police arrived. They took my statement, called an ambulance to check me over, even though I insisted I was physically fine. One kind female officer draped a blanket around my shoulders and sat with me while I gave my account of what happened. Hours later, I was finally cleared to go home. A police cruiser dropped me off at my building. I thanked the officers profusely, my hands still shaking as I unlocked my door. Once inside, I collapsed onto my couch, utterly drained. The events of the night kept replaying in my head. If that cop hadn't shown up when he did... I shuddered, unable to finish the thought. I called my mom, needing to hear her voice. As soon as she answered, I broke down sobbing, the full impact of what I'd been through finally hitting me. She listened as I poured out the whole story, making soothing noises. "Oh, honey," she said when I'd finished. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, but you're safe now. You did everything right." We talked for over an hour. By the time we hung up, I felt calmer, though still shaky. I made myself some tea and curled up in bed, leaving all the lights on. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his hands on me. I kept imagining what might have happened if things had gone differently. The next few weeks were rough. I jumped at every sound, flinched when anyone got too close on the street. I couldn't bring myself to take the subway. I spent a fortune on Ubers that month. My friends and family were wonderfully supportive, but I still felt on edge all the time. Gradually, things got better. I started seeing a therapist, which helped immensely. I took a self-defense class. Slowly, I regained my confidence and started venturing out alone again. But even now, years later, I'm still affected by what happened that night. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, always looking over my shoulder. I never wear headphones when I'm walking alone. And I avoid that subway stop entirely. I'll walk an extra 10 minutes to the next one over. Sometimes I wonder about that cop who saved me. Did he know how close he came to preventing a tragedy? Does he ever think about that snowy night? Or was it just another shift for him? I never got his name, but I'll be forever grateful to him. I share this story as a reminder to always trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And to my fellow city dwellers, please always be aware of your surroundings. It only takes a moment for things to go terribly wrong. I was lucky. So many others aren't. I'll carry that night with me forever, a chilling reminder of how quickly safety can turn to danger, even in familiar places. But I refuse to let fear rule my life. I'm a survivor, and I'm stronger for what I've been through. I was only 13 that summer, but the memory of what happened at Lake Willow still sends chills down my spine. My best friend Kay and I had been looking forward to our annual camping trip for months. Our families always rented cabins at the same lakeside campground, and we'd spend lazy days swimming, hiking, and roasting marshmallows under the stars. This particular day started out like any other. Kay and I woke up early, scarfed down some cereal, and raced each other down to the lake. The morning air was crisp and cool against our skin as we made our way to the wooden dock. We loved sitting at the end with our feet dangling in the water, watching the mist rise off the glassy surface. As we approached, I noticed a man standing near the dock that I didn't recognize. He looked to be in his 40s, with graying hair and a friendly smile. I figured he must be another camper staying at the grounds. "Good morning, girls," he called out cheerfully as we got closer. "Beautiful day for a swim, isn't it?" Kay and I exchanged glances. We'd been taught not to talk to strangers, but he seemed nice enough. Plus, we were still within sight of the cabins. What harm could come from a little small talk? "Yeah, it's perfect," I replied with a shy smile. We made our way to the end of the dock and sat down, letting our toes skim the cool water. The man walked over and leaned against one of the posts nearby. "I'm Jim," he said. "Are you two staying at the campground?" We nodded, and I introduced myself and Kay. Jim asked us how long we'd been coming to Lake Willow, and we eagerly told him about our annual trips. He was easy to talk to, laughing at our stories and asking lots of questions. Before I knew it, nearly an hour had passed. "Say," Jim said suddenly, "would you girls like to see something really special? There's a secret island just across the lake that hardly anyone knows about. It's got the most amazing view of the mountains." Kay's eyes lit up. An island. That sounds so cool. I hesitated. "I don't know. We should probably ask our parents first." Jim waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, it'll just take a few minutes to zip over there and back. They won't even know you're gone. Come on, live a little. How often do you get a chance for a real adventure?" I glanced at Kay, who was practically bouncing with excitement. "Please," she begged, "it'll be so much fun." Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. Jim's enthusiasm was contagious, and the idea of exploring a secret island was tempting. Plus, we could see the island from here. It really wasn't far. "Great!" Jim exclaimed. "My boat's just over there. Let's go." As we followed him down the dock, a nagging feeling of unease crept over me. Something about this didn't feel right. But Kay was already climbing into the small motorboat, and I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of her. Jim helped me aboard, his hand lingering a bit too long on my arm. I tried to brush off the discomfort, telling myself I was being paranoid. But when he bent down to untie the boat, I caught a whiff of alcohol on his breath. My heart started to race. "Wait," I said quickly. "Maybe we should tell someone where we're going first." Jim's cheerful demeanor slipped for just a second, revealing a flash of anger in his eyes. But then the smile was back, wider than ever. "Don't be silly," he said. "We'll be back before anyone even notices. Now sit down so we can get going." I opened my mouth to protest again, but suddenly a booming voice called out from the shore. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I whipped around to see my Uncle Jack striding purposefully down the dock, his face a mask of fury. Relief flooded through me. "Uncle Jack," I cried out, "we were just—" "Get out of that boat right now," he ordered, cutting me off. "Both of you." Confused and a little frightened by his tone, Kay and I scrambled back onto the dock. Uncle Jack put a protective arm around each of us, glaring daggers at Jim. "And you," he growled, "I suggest you get the hell out of here before I call the police." Jim's friendly mask had vanished completely. He sneered at us as he started the boat's engine. "Whatever," he spat. "Plenty more fish in the sea." As he sped away, I realized with horror that the boat didn't even belong to him. I could see the real owner running down the beach, shouting about his stolen property. Uncle Jack hugged us tightly. "Are you girls okay? Did he hurt you?" We shook our heads, still in shock. "I can't believe how stupid we were," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "He seemed so nice." "It's not your fault," Uncle Jack assured us. "Predators like that are experts at seeming trustworthy. But you can't ever go off with a stranger, no matter how friendly they seem. Do you understand?" We nodded solemnly, the full gravity of what almost happened sinking in. If Uncle Jack hadn't shown up when he did, I shuddered, unable to complete the thought. The rest of the day passed in a blur of police statements and tearful conversations with our parents. I expected them to be furious, but they were just relieved we were safe. That night, as Kay and I huddled in our sleeping bags, neither of us could sleep. Every sound from the woods made us jump. I kept replaying the day's events in my mind, thinking of all the little red flags I'd ignored. The alcohol on his breath, the way his hand lingered too long, the flash of anger when I hesitated. "I can't believe we almost got in that boat," Kay whispered. "What do you think he would have done to us?" I shook my head, not wanting to imagine. "I don't know, but I don't think we ever would have come back." We were silent for a long moment, the weight of our close call hanging heavy in the air. "Promise me something," I said finally. "Promise we'll never do anything that stupid again. No matter how nice someone seems or how fun it sounds, we stick together and we tell an adult first, okay?" "I promise," Kay said solemnly. We pinky swore on it, cementing our pact. It would be years before either of us felt truly comfortable around strangers again. To this day, I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings and trust my gut when something feels off. I often wonder what became of Jim, if he was ever caught, or if he went on to hurt other children who weren't as lucky as Kay and I. The thought makes me sick to my stomach. All I can do is be grateful for Uncle Jack's perfect timing and hope that by sharing my story, I can prevent others from making the same potentially deadly mistake. Lake Willow was our favorite place in the world. but we never went back after that summer. Some experiences change you forever, leaving scars that never fully heal. But they also make you stronger, wiser, and more aware of the dangers that can lurk behind a friendly smile. I'll never forget that day on the dock, or how close we came to becoming just another tragic headline. It's a lesson I'll carry with me always, a constant reminder to stay vigilant and trust my instincts. As I got closer, they spread out a bit, partially blocking the sidewalk. My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my cool. Just as I was about to pass them, one of the men stepped directly in front of me. "Halt," he said firmly. "Police, we need to see some identification." Alarm bells went off in my head immediately. These guys didn't look like cops at all. No uniforms, no badges visible. This had to be some kind of setup. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm on the outside while my mind raced. I knew I had to think fast. "Oh, thank God you're here, officers," I said, putting on my best relieved expression. "I was just about to call for help. There's a group of Russian gangsters following me. I think they're trying to mug me or worse." The cops looked at each other, seeming thrown off by my response. I pressed on quickly before they could regroup. "They're right around the corner," I said urgently. "If we hurry, we can catch them. I can identify them for you." I gestured back the way I'd come, as if eager to lead them to the imaginary Russians. The ringleader hesitated, clearly not sure how to respond to this unexpected turn. We'll check it out," he said finally. "You should get home safely now." "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to sound concerned. "I'd feel much safer if I could stay with you officers until those Russians are caught." "That won't be necessary," the man said gruffly. "We've got it under control. Move along now." I nodded gratefully. "Thank you so much, officers. I feel much better knowing you're on the case." As I walked away, I could hear them muttering to each other behind me. I resisted the urge to break into a run, forcing myself to keep a steady pace until I was around the corner and out of sight. Once I was sure I was clear, I let out a huge sigh of relief and slumped against a wall, my legs shaking. I couldn't believe that had actually worked. The adrenaline was still coursing through me. Looking back, I realized how incredibly lucky I was that they bought my bluff. If they had called me on it, things could have gone very badly. But in that moment of panic, playing on fears of Russian criminals in the area was the first thing that popped into my head. I hurried the rest of the way home, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally made it to my apartment, I locked the door and collapsed onto my couch, still trembling slightly. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, thinking of all the ways it could have gone wrong. What if they had gotten violent? What if there had been real cops nearby and I'd inadvertently sent a group of criminals their way? The next day, I seriously considered reporting the incident to the actual police, but I was worried about potential retaliation if the men found out. And to be honest, a part of me was embarrassed about how easily I'd fallen for their initial ruse. So in the end, I kept it to myself. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and paranoid whenever I went out at night. I started varying my routes home and avoiding that particular street entirely. I also began carrying pepper spray just in case. Gradually the fear faded and life went back to normal. But that night left a lasting impact on me. It made me much more aware of my surroundings and taught me the value of quick thinking in dangerous situations. Looking back now, I'm still amazed at how I managed to keep my cool and come up with that story on the spot. I'm not usually that quick on my feet. I guess the surge of adrenaline and survival instinct took over. I've often wondered what would have happened if I'd reacted differently, if I'd tried to run, or if I'd gone along with their fake police act. Would they have robbed me? Beaten me up? I'll never know for sure. The incident also made me reflect on how easily criminals can impersonate authority figures to take advantage of people. It's a scary thought, but an important one to be aware of. I still live in Berlin, and I still love this city. But that night changed the way I move through it, especially after dark. I'm more cautious now, more observant, and I always trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. Sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, wondering if I'll see those men again. So far I haven't, but the memory of that night is always there in the back of my mind. A reminder of how quickly a normal evening can turn into something terrifying. I've shared this story with a few close friends, partly as a warning to be careful, and partly to process the experience myself. Their reactions have ranged from horror to admiration for my quick thinking. But unless you've been in a situation like that, it's hard to truly understand how it feels. The whole incident probably only lasted a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Time seemed to slow down, and every word, every movement felt crucial. It's amazing how the mind can focus so intently when you're in genuine fear for your safety. I've often wondered about those men. Were they experienced criminals or just opportunists? Did they target me specifically? Or was I just in the wrong place at the wrong time? And most importantly, did they ever try this scheme again on someone else who might not have been as lucky? There's a part of me that feels guilty for potentially putting other people at risk by not reporting it. But at the time, all I could think about was my own safety and getting away from the situation as quickly as possible. This experience has definitely made me more sympathetic to victims of crime. It's easy to say what you would do in a dangerous situation, but when you're actually in the moment, it's a whole different story. Fear can paralyze you, or it can push you to do things you never thought you were capable of. I'm grateful that my instincts kicked in and I was able to talk my way out of the situation. But I'm also acutely aware of how differently things could have gone. It's a sobering thought. Now, whenever I hear stories of people being mugged or assaulted, I don't judge their reactions. I know firsthand how unpredictable and terrifying those situations can be. You never really know how you'll react until you're in the moment. I still enjoy living in Berlin, but I'm much more cautious now, especially at night. I make sure my phone is always charged when I go out. I stay aware of my surroundings, and I'm not afraid to trust my gut if something feels off. This experience taught me that danger can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. By taking control of the narrative, I was able to turn the tables on my potential attackers and escape unharmed. But it also taught me the value of community and looking out for one another. Now, if I see someone who looks uncomfortable or in potential danger, I don't hesitate to check if they're okay or offer help. We all need to look out for each other. In the end, I'm just grateful that I made it home safely that night. But the memory of those tense moments on that dark Berlin street will stay with me forever. A stark reminder of how quickly life can change and how important it is to stay alert and think on your feet. I was shaking as I sat on my worn couch, clutching a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The storm outside raged on, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees surrounding my isolated farmhouse. But it wasn't the storm that had me on edge. It was the events of earlier that evening that left me utterly terrified and unable to sleep. It had started out as a typical dreary night on the farm. I was curled up reading a book, trying to ignore the deafening cracks of thunder that made me jump every few minutes. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned, settling into itself as it had done for generations. My family had owned this property for over a century, though I was the first to live here alone. At 28, I had inherited it after my parents passed away last year. While I loved the peace and quiet most days, nights like this made me acutely aware of just how isolated I was out here. Around 9 p.m., there was a loud, urgent knocking at the front door. I froze, my heart racing. Who on earth would be out here on a night like this? Cautiously, I approached the door and called out, "Who's there?" A man's voice responded, sounding distressed. "Please, I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car broke down on the road and my phone is dead. Could I possibly use your phone to call for help?" I hesitated, torn between wanting to help and being wary of strangers. Eventually, my Midwestern hospitality won out. "Hold on, I'm coming," I called back, unlocking the door. As I opened it, I was hit with a gust of wind and rain. Standing on my porch was a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, soaking wet and shivering. He gave me a relieved smile. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm David." "Emma," I replied, stepping back to let him in. "The phone's in the kitchen. Come on in." David followed me inside, his shoes squeaking on the hardwood floors. As we entered the kitchen, he glanced around, taking in the worn cabinets and antique appliances. "Wow, this place is incredible. So much history here." I nodded, handing him the cordless phone. "Yeah, it's been in my family for generations." As David dialed, I noticed him examining the room more closely, his eyes lingering on certain spots. When he finished his call, he turned to me with an odd expression. "You know, it's funny. This kitchen reminds me so much of my grandmother's old place. She even had that exact same chip in the countertop, right there by the sink." I frowned, glancing at the chip he'd pointed out. It had happened when I was a kid, dropping a heavy pot while helping my mom cook. How could he possibly know about that? "Oh, what a coincidence," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you get through to someone?" David nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he wandered into the living room, looking around with increasing interest. "You said this place has been in your family for generations? That's fascinating. I bet it has so many stories to tell." Alarm bells were starting to go off in my head. Something about his demeanor felt off, almost too familiar with the space. "Yeah, lots of history," I said vaguely. "So when is your ride coming?" David turned to me, a strange glint in his eye. "Oh, it'll be a while yet. This storm is making travel difficult. Say, is that old rocking chair still up in the attic? The one with the intricate carvings on the arms?" I felt the blood drain from my face. There was no way he could know about that chair. It had been my great-grandmother's, and it had been stored in our attic for decades. I'd only seen it once as a child. I'm not sure what you're talking about," I stammered, backing away slightly. "Look, I think it's best if you wait outside for your ride. I'm not comfortable having a stranger in my home." David's expression darkened. "Oh, come on, Emma. Don't be like that. We're practically old friends, aren't we? After all, I know this house almost as well as you do." My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear over the rush of blood in my ears. "Who are you? How do you know these things?" He took a step towards me, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. "I told you, I'm David, and I know lots of things about this place, like how the third step from the top on the back stairs creaks so loud it'll wake the dead, or how there's a hidden compartment behind the fireplace where your great-grandfather used to stash his moonshine during Prohibition." I was shaking now, tears pricking at my eyes. "Please leave. Now, or I'm calling the police." David's smile faded, replaced by a look of anger. "Now that's not very hospitable, is it? After all, I'm just a stranded traveler seeking shelter from the storm. It would be a shame if something were to happen to me out there in this weather. People might start asking questions." The threat in his words was unmistakable. I backed away further, fumbling behind me for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around the handle of a large kitchen knife on the counter. "I won't ask again," I said, my voice quavering as I brought the knife into view. "Get out of my house, now." For a long moment, David just stared at me, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and began backing towards the door. All right. No need to get violent. I can see when I'm not wanted." I followed him, knife still raised, as he made his way to the front door. As he stepped out onto the porch, he turned back to me with a chilling smile. "This isn't over, Emma. I'll be seeing you again soon. After all, we have so much catching up to do." With that, he disappeared into the stormy night. I slammed the door shut, locking it and sliding the deadbolt into place with trembling hands. Then I sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the full weight of what had just happened hit me. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every sound, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. As dawn broke, I called the police to report what had happened. They took my statement and promised to keep an eye out, but with no real evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself constantly on edge. I installed a security system, got a large dog for protection, and even considered selling the farm and moving away. But this place was my home, my heritage. I refused to let some creep drive me away from it. Even now, months later, I still have trouble sleeping at night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sets my heart racing. I keep replaying that night over and over, wondering how David knew so much about my home and family. Was he some distant relative I'd never met? A stalker who had been watching me? Or something even more sinister? I may never know the truth, but one thing's for certain. I'll never again open my door to a stranger on a dark and stormy night. The safety I once felt in my isolated farmhouse has been shattered, replaced by a constant, gnawing fear that someday, somehow, David will make good on his promise to return. And next time, a kitchen knife might not be enough to save me. I was driving down a lonely stretch of highway, the rain pounding against my windshield with such force I could barely see the road ahead. The weather forecast had warned of severe thunderstorms, but I hadn't expected anything like this. Lightning illuminated the sky every few seconds, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that made me flinch each time. I was on my way to visit my sister in the next state over, a trip I'd made dozens of times before. But I'd never encountered a storm this intense. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, leaning forward and squinting through the downpour. Suddenly, there was a loud pop, and my car lurched to the side. No, I muttered, fighting to keep control as I pulled onto the narrow shoulder. The car shuddered to a stop, and I sat there for a moment, heart racing. I'd blown a tire. I fumbled for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. Cursing under my breath, I popped the trunk and grabbed my raincoat before stepping out into the deluge. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet as I made my way to inspect the damage. Sure enough, my front driver's side tire was completely shredded. I had a spare, but changing it in this weather would be next to impossible. Not to mention dangerous on the side of the highway. I was weighing my options when headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the sheets of rain. Relief washed over me as I saw it was a tow truck. What incredible luck! The truck pulled up behind me, and a burly man in a yellow slicker hopped out. "Having some car trouble?" he called over the howling wind. "Blew a tire," I shouted back. "Any chance you can give me a tow to the nearest town?" He nodded. "Sure thing. Hop in and we'll get you out of this mess." I grabbed my phone and wallet from the car, then climbed into the passenger seat of the tow truck. The cab was blessedly warm and dry. "Thanks so much," I said, removing my drenched coat. "I can't believe my luck that you happened to be driving by." The driver grunted non-committally as he pulled back onto the highway. Now that I could see him clearly, I noticed he was older than I'd first thought, probably in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and deep-set eyes. "Where you headed?" he asked gruffly. "Next town over is fine," I replied. "Anywhere I can get my tire fixed." He nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. We drove in silence for several minutes, the only sound the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers. I was starting to relax when I realized we seemed to be turning off the main highway. Where exactly are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "Shortcut," the driver replied. "Get you there quicker." But as we continued down an unmarked dirt road, my unease grew. The trees pressed in close on either side, branches scraping against the truck. We hadn't passed any signs of civilization in what felt like ages. "Look, I really appreciate the help, but maybe you could just take me back to the highway," I suggested. "I can wait for another tow there." The driver's grip tightened on the wheel. "Don't worry," he said, his tone oddly flat. "We're almost there." My heart began to race. This was wrong, all wrong. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. "Let me out," I demanded, unable to keep the panic from my voice. "Stop the truck right now." A cruel smile spread across the driver's weathered face. Now why would I do that when we're having so much fun? Terror seized me as I realized the grave danger I was in. My mind raced, trying to figure a way out of this nightmare. But before I could act, the truck jerked to a stop in front of a dilapidated old barn. The driver turned to me, his eyes gleaming with malice. "End of the line, friend." I lunged for the door, frantically pulling at the handle. To my shock, it opened. He must have unlocked it when we stopped. I tumbled out onto the muddy ground as the driver cursed. Scrambling to my feet, I took off running into the storm. I could hear him crashing through the undergrowth behind me, shouting threats. Lightning flashed, momentarily blinding me. I stumbled but kept going, branches whipping at my face. My lungs burned as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The sound of pursuit faded, but I didn't dare slow down. I had no idea where I was or which direction led back to the highway. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the tree line onto a paved road. Gasping for breath, I looked wildly in both directions, praying to see headlights. As if in answer to my desperate wish, a vehicle appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, terrified it would pass me by. To my immense relief, it slowed to a stop. It was another tow truck. A young man leaned out the window. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Between ragged breaths, I managed to gasp out my story. The blown tire, the creepy driver, my narrow escape. The man's eyes widened in alarm. "Holy shit, get in," he said, reaching across to unlock the passenger door. "We need to call the cops right away." As we sped toward town, I provided as many details as I could remember to the 911 dispatcher. By the time we reached the local police station, several patrol cars were already heading out to search the area. I spent the next few hours giving my official statement and answering endless questions. They seemed skeptical at first, but became more concerned as they were unable to locate any trace of the mysterious tow truck driver. When they finally allowed me to leave, I was utterly exhausted. The young tow truck driver who'd rescued me insisted on giving me a ride to the nearest motel. "You've been through hell tonight," he said. "The least I can do is make sure you get some rest." I was beyond grateful for his kindness. As I settled into the lumpy motel bed, my mind kept replaying the night's terrifying events. Sleep seemed impossible, but eventually sheer emotional and physical exhaustion won out. I awoke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. For a blissful moment, I thought perhaps it had all been a nightmare, but the aches in my body and the scratches on my arms confirmed the horrifying reality. After a long, hot shower, I made my way to the tiny motel office. The elderly woman at the desk looked up as I entered. "You're all over the news, young man," she said, gesturing to a small TV in the corner. Sure enough, there was my car on the screen, still sitting on the side of the highway. The reporter was saying that despite an extensive search, no trace had been found of the tow truck or its driver. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. What if they never found him? What if he was still out there, prowling the roads for his next victim? The police called later that morning to say they'd located the abandoned barn, but there was no sign anyone had been there recently. The case remained frustratingly open. In the days and weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at every sound, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I couldn't bring myself to drive alone at night. The tiniest car problem filled me with irrational panic. Months have passed, and the police have all but given up. They chalk it up to some twisted prank or a figment of my imagination. But I know what I experienced that night was terrifyingly real. I still lie awake some nights, remembering the malevolent gleam in that driver's eyes, wondering if he's still out there, waiting for another stranded motorist to fall into his trap. The rational part of my brain says I'm safe now, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But a primal fear lingers, whispering that perhaps someday, somehow, I'll find myself once again at the mercy of that nightmarish tow truck driver. So I'm sharing my story as a warning. If you find yourself broken down on a lonely road some stormy night, think twice before accepting help from a stranger. You never know what sinister intentions may lurk behind a seemingly helpful facade. Stay safe out there and trust your instincts. I only wish I'd listened to mine before climbing into that truck. The memory of that night will haunt me for the rest of my days. I still remember that weekend like it was yesterday. The four of us, Jenny, Alex, Rachel, and myself, had been planning our mountain getaway for months. We were all so excited to escape the city and spend a few days relaxing at this quaint little cabin we'd rented. As we drove up the winding mountain roads, the weather started to turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and a light drizzle began to fall. By the time we reached the cabin, it was pouring rain. We rushed inside with our bags, laughing as we shook the water from our hair and clothes. The cabin was cozy and rustic, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the misty forest. We got a fire going and settled in for the evening, cracking open some beers and playing card games as the storm raged outside. Around 9 p.m., there was a loud knock at the door. We all froze, exchanging nervous glances. Who could possibly be out in this weather? Alex cautiously went to answer it, while the rest of us waited anxiously. Standing on the porch was a man in his 40s, soaking wet and looking somewhat disheveled. He introduced himself as Tom and explained that his car had broken down about a mile down the road. He asked if he could use our phone to call for help. My first instinct was sympathy. The poor guy was stranded in this awful storm, but something about his demeanor felt off. His eyes darted around nervously, and he seemed overly eager to get inside. Against my better judgment, we invited him in to dry off and use the landline. As Tom made his call, I noticed him studying the cabin intently, his gaze lingering on each of us. A chill ran down my spine. When Tom hung up, he said the earliest a tow truck could come was morning. He asked if he could stay the night, offering to sleep on the couch. We all exchanged uneasy glances. None of us wanted a stranger staying over, but it felt cruel to turn him away in this weather. Reluctantly, we agreed he could stay. Tom thanked us profusely, but there was an odd glint in his eye that made my skin crawl. As the night wore on, his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He asked probing questions about our lives and relationships. At one point, I caught him rifling through our bags when he thought no one was looking. My unease grew into full-blown panic when I went to use the bathroom and noticed Tom's jacket hanging by the door. A folded paper was sticking out of the pocket. My hands shaking, I carefully pulled it out. It was a crude map of the area, with our cabin circled in red. Scrawled in the margins were notes, 4 targets, and 2M, 2F. My blood ran cold as I realized the horrifying truth. This man had targeted us. He hadn't ended up here by accident at all. I quietly showed the others what I'd found. We were all terrified, trapped in this remote cabin with a potential killer. But we knew we had to act fast. We devised a plan. Rachel pretended to get a call from her boyfriend, a local sheriff who was on his way over. As she loudly discussed his imminent arrival, Tom's face went pale. He stammered some excuse about feeling better and needing to check on his car. As he headed for the door, Alex and I flanked him. We made it clear in no uncertain terms that we knew what he was up to and that he needed to leave immediately. Tom's friendly facade crumbled, replaced by a look of cold rage that still haunts my nightmares. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might attack us, but outnumbered 4-1, he seemed to think better of it. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out into the rain. We immediately locked and barricaded the door, then called the real police. They arrived about an hour later to take our statements. They found Tom's abandoned car down the road, loaded with duct tape, rope, and other sinister items. To this day, I shudder to think what might have happened if we hadn't discovered his true intentions. The police never managed to track Tom down. He seemingly vanished into thin air that night. I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, imagining what horrors we narrowly escaped. That weekend taught me to always trust my instincts. Evil can lurk behind the friendliest faces, waiting for an opportunity to strike. We were lucky to make it out unharmed, but the psychological scars remain. Whenever I see stories of missing hikers or campers in the news, I can't help but wonder, did they encounter someone like Tom? Someone who seemed harmless at first, but harbored dark intentions? It's a chilling thought that still keeps me up at night all these years later. I'm sharing this story as a warning to others. Please always be aware of your surroundings and trust your gut feelings. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Don't be afraid to be rude if it means protecting yourself and your loved ones. Our quiet getaway turned into a nightmare, but it could have been so much worse. I'm grateful every day that we made it out alive, but I'll never forget the look in Tom's eyes as he left, the cold, dead stare of a predator whose plan had been foiled. I only hope he never succeeded in hurting anyone else. Stay safe out there, everyone. You never know who might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Our world can be a dangerous place, but by staying vigilant and looking out for each other, we can make it through even the darkest nights. I've never been so terrified in my life. It all started when I decided to spend a few days at my family's beach house during a nasty storm that was rolling through. I thought it would be peaceful, just me, the sound of the crashing waves, and a good book. Boy, was I wrong. The first day was actually pretty nice. I arrived in the afternoon, got settled in, and spent the evening watching the storm build from the safety of the living room. The wind was really picking up, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I remember thinking how glad I was to be inside, warm and dry. It was around 10 p.m. when I heard the first knock at the door. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Who the hell could that be out in this weather? I cautiously approached the door and peered out the peephole. 2 men were standing there, soaked to the bone and looking pretty ragged. Against my better judgment, I cracked the door open. They introduced themselves as Mike and Jeff and said their boat had gotten caught in the storm. They'd seen the lights on in our house and were hoping to use a phone to call for help. I hesitated for a moment, but they seemed harmless enough. Plus, I'd feel awful turning someone away in this weather. So I let them in. At first, everything seemed fine. I got them some towels to dry off and showed them to the landline in the kitchen. Mike made a call while Jeff paced around, looking out the windows at the raging storm. I tried to make small talk, asking where they were from and if they vacationed here often. Their answers were vague, and they kept glancing at each other. That's when I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something just felt off. I noticed Jeff eyeing up the valuables in the living room a little too intently, and Mike's call seemed to be taking an awfully long time. I casually mentioned that my parents would be arriving soon, hoping that might deter any funny business. Mike hung up the phone and gave me a strange look. "I thought you said you were here alone," he asked. A chill ran down my spine. I had never mentioned that. From that moment on, their whole demeanor changed. The polite smiles were gone, replaced by cold, calculating stares. They started asking pointed questions about the house, how many bedrooms, if there was a safe, that kind of thing. Jeff wandered into the living room and picked up a framed family photo. "Nice place you've got here," he said with a smirk. "Bet your folks are loaded." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over the blood rushing in my ears. I knew I was in serious trouble. These guys weren't stranded boaters. They were criminals who had targeted our house, and I had let them right in. I tried to keep my voice steady as I suggested they should probably get going. Mike's eyes narrowed. "What's the rush?" he asked, taking a step towards me. "I think we'll stick around for a while. You've been such a gracious host after all." Jeff chuckled darkly. "Yeah, why don't you give us a tour of the place? I'm especially interested in seeing the master bedroom. Bet that's where all the good stuff is kept." I was desperately trying to figure out an escape plan. The storm was still raging outside, but at this point, I'd rather take my chances out there than stay trapped in here with these two. I inched towards the back door, hoping I could make a break for it. But Mike must have sensed what I was thinking. In 2 quick strides, he was between me and the door. "Going somewhere?" he growled. That's when the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, lit only by occasional flashes of lightning. I heard Jeff swear and Mike shout something. In that moment of confusion, I acted on pure instinct. I shoved past Mike with all my strength and bolted for the door. I fumbled with the lock for what felt like an eternity before finally wrenching it open. The wind and rain hit me like a physical force as I stumbled out onto the deck. I could hear Mike and Jeff shouting behind me, their heavy footsteps in pursuit. I ran blindly through the storm, my bare feet slipping in the wet sand. The beach house next door was dark, no one there to help. I veered towards the road, praying I could flag down a passing car. Suddenly, A hand grabbed my arm, yanking me backwards. It was Mike. His face was twisted with rage as he shouted something I couldn't hear over the howling wind. I reacted without thinking, my fist connecting solidly with his jaw. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I used that split second to my advantage and took off running again. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I made it to the main road and started waving my arms frantically at the headlights of an approaching car. To my immense relief, it was a police cruiser. The officer inside looked shocked to see a soaking wet, terrified woman appear out of nowhere. I was babbling incoherently, trying to explain what had happened between gasping breaths. The next few hours were a blur. More police arrived, guns drawn as they approached the beach house. Mike and Jeff were caught trying to flee out the back. It turns out they were wanted in 3 states for a string of home invasions. They'd been staking out vacation homes in the area, waiting for the perfect opportunity. I gave my statement to the police, still shaking like a leaf. They praised me for my quick thinking and bravery, but I didn't feel brave. I felt stupid for ever letting those men in and utterly terrified by how close I'd come to God knows what. It's been a few months now, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I have trouble sleeping and I startle at every little noise. I can't even look at the beach house without feeling sick to my stomach. My parents want to sell it, but part of me doesn't want to let those bastards take that away from us too. I know I'm lucky. Things could have ended so much worse, but I can't shake the memory of those cold, predatory eyes or the sound of footsteps chasing me through the storm. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. So let my experience be a warning. Trust your gut instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And please, be careful who you let into your home. You never know who might be wearing a friendly mask, hiding much darker intentions beneath. "What have we got?" I asked, hurrying over to help. "Male, mid-30s, no ID, found unconscious on the side of the road," one of the EMTs responded tersely. "Vitals are stable, but he's completely unresponsive. Possible head trauma." I helped wheel the man to an empty bed in the ER. His clothes were soaked through, mud caked on his shoes. There was something off about him that I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted around beneath closed lids, or how his fingers kept twitching. "I'll take it from here," I told the paramedics. "Thanks, guys." As they left, I started the usual intake process, hooking up monitors, checking vitals, searching for any obvious injuries. The whole time I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. But every time I glanced at the patient, his eyes were still closed. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on my job. "Sir, can you hear me?" I asked loudly, shining a penlight in his eyes. No response. Just then, the power flickered ominously. A few seconds later, it went out completely, plunging the ER into darkness. "Shit," I muttered. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the bed beside me. My blood ran cold. I slowly turned, pointing my phone's light toward the patient. His eyes were open now, reflecting the light like an animal's, and they were fixed directly on me with a predatory intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, he lunged at me with inhuman speed. I barely managed to stumble backwards, narrowly avoiding his grasping hands. He let out an animalistic shriek that chilled me to my core. "Help!" I yelled, hoping someone would hear me over the storm. "Security!" But in that moment of distraction, he was on me. We crashed to the floor, my phone skittering away and leaving us in near total darkness. His weight pinned me down as he clawed and snapped at my face. I could feel his hot, rancid breath on my skin. Panic surged through me. This wasn't a normal patient. This was something else entirely, something monstrous. And it was trying to kill me. I fought with everything I had, desperately trying to push him off. But he was inhumanly strong. His fingers found my throat and started to squeeze. Spots danced in my vision as I gasped for air. In a last-ditch effort, I managed to grab a nearby metal tray and smash it against the side of his head. The impact stunned him just long enough for me to wiggle free and scramble to my feet. I ran blindly through the darkened ER, hearing him snarl and give chase behind me. My only thought was to get away, to find help, to survive. I burst through a set of double doors, finding myself in a long hallway. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow, creating monstrous shadows. My pursuer's footsteps echoed behind me, getting closer. I sprinted down the hall, my heart pounding in my ears. Where was everyone? Why wasn't anyone responding to the commotion? I tried door after door, finding them all locked. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was trapped. Just as I was about to give up hope, I spotted a sliver of natural light at the end of the hall, an exit sign above a door. Freedom. With a final burst of energy, I raced toward it. I could hear ragged breathing right behind me, feel clawed fingers grasping at my back. I slammed into the door at full speed, praying it wasn't locked. By some miracle, it gave way. I tumbled out into the raging storm, rain immediately soaking me to the bone. But I didn't stop. I kept running, my feet splashing through puddles, until I reached the parking lot. Only then did I dare to look back. The door hung open, but there was no sign of my pursuer. Had he given up? Or was he waiting, watching from the shadows? I didn't stick around to find out. I jumped into my car, peeled out of the lot, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what just happened started to sink in. What the hell was that thing? Why didn't anyone come to help? And most disturbingly, what happened to the other patients and staff in the hospital? I wanted to call the police, but what would I even say? That I was attacked by some kind of monster patient? They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. So I went home, locked all the doors and windows, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those feral eyes staring back at me, heard that inhuman growl. As the sun rose, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to that hospital. I couldn't risk facing that thing again, or worse, finding out what might have happened to my coworkers. I called in and quit on the spot, found a new job in a different city, but no matter how far I run, I can't shake the memory of that night. The lingering fear that someday, somehow, that creature will find me again. Sometimes on stormy nights, I swear I can hear scratching at my window, see glowing eyes peering in from the darkness. But maybe that's just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I tell myself to get through the night. All I know for certain is that I'll never set foot in Mercy General again. And I pray that whatever was in that hospital that night never finds its way out into the world. Because if it does, God help us all. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was just a violent patient on PCP or bath salts. Maybe the isolation and darkness of the power outage made everything seem more terrifying than it really was. But deep down, I know that doesn't account for the inhuman strength, the animal-like behavior, the way its eyes reflected light. There was something truly unnatural about that being. In the months since, I've done some digging, tried to find any news reports about strange happenings at the hospital that night, but there's nothing. It's like it never happened. I even drove by the hospital once, in broad daylight. It looked completely normal. People coming and going, ambulances in the bay. No signs of the chaos and terror I experienced. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. If the stress of night shifts and sleep deprivation finally made me crack. But then I look at the scars on my arms from where it clawed me, and I know it was real. I've thought about reaching out to former co-workers, seeing if they experienced anything strange. But I'm afraid of what I might learn. Afraid they'll tell me everything's fine and I'll start to doubt my own sanity. Or worse, afraid they'll confirm my fears and shatter what little peace of mind I've managed to regain. So I try to move on with my life. I work day shifts now at a small clinic across the state. I see a therapist to deal with the PTSD and nightmares. I'm slowly starting to feel normal again, but I know I'll never be the same. That night changed me fundamentally. I now know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, that lurk in the shadows just beyond our perception. And sometimes, on nights when the wind howls and tree branches scrape against my bedroom window, I lie awake wondering, what if it wasn't confined to the hospital? What if it's out there somewhere, hunting for its next victim? What if, someday, I'll open my door to find those feral eyes staring back at me, ready to finish what it started that stormy night at Mercy General? I don't have answers. I don't know if I ever will. All I can do is stay vigilant, trust my instincts, and hope that whatever cosmic forces unleashed that horror have seen fit to contain it once more. But a part of me knows that's wishful thinking, because once you've seen behind the veil, once you've glimpsed the true terrors that exist in the world, you can never truly unsee them. You can only hope to stay one step ahead, always looking over your shoulder, praying you never cross paths with true evil again. So I keep running, keep trying to build a new life far away from that cursed hospital. But no matter how far I go, the memories follow. The fear lingers, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispers that it's only a matter of time before the past catches up with me. Until then, all I can do is share my story, to warn others, to make sure that if anyone else encounters something like this, they know they're not alone. They're not crazy. The monsters are real, and sometimes they wear the faces of those we're meant to help and heal. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and if you ever find yourself working the night shift at a hospital during a storm, get out while you still can. I was exhausted and just wanted to get home, but I knew I had to stay alert in these dangerous conditions. The last thing I needed was to hydroplane or veer off the road. I leaned forward, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I peered through the windshield. Suddenly, a figure appeared in my headlights, standing on the side of the road with their thumb out. I nearly swerved in surprise. Who would be hitchhiking in weather like this? My first instinct was to keep driving. Picking up strangers was risky even in the best circumstances. But as I got closer, I could see it was a man who looked utterly drenched and miserable. Against my better judgment, I felt a pang of sympathy. He must be desperate to be out here in this storm. Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself slowing down and pulling over to the shoulder. I rolled down the passenger window a crack. "Hey there, you need a ride?" I called out. The man hurried over, hunched against the rain. "Oh, thank God," he said. "Yes, please. I've been stuck out here for hours." I hesitated for a moment, but then reached over and unlocked the door. The man climbed in quickly, bringing a gust of wind and rain with him. "Thank you so much," he said breathlessly as he settled into the seat. "I didn't think anyone would stop in this weather." "No problem," I replied, trying to get a better look at him in the dim light. He appeared to be in his 40s, with dark hair plastered to his head from the rain. His clothes were soaked through. "Where you headed?" I asked as I pulled back onto the road. "Just up to the next town," he said. "My car broke down a ways back and I've been trying to get a ride." I nodded. "That's rough. Glad I could help out. I'm Jake, by the way." "Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Tom," he replied. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I kept stealing glances at Tom out of the corner of my eye. There was something a bit off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was just the stress of being stranded in the storm. "So, what brought you out this way tonight?" I asked, trying to make conversation. Tom was quiet for a moment before answering. "Oh, just some business I had to take care of." "Ah, gotcha," I said. His vague response made me a little uneasy, but I tried to brush it off. We continued down the lonely stretch of road, the only sounds the pounding rain and rumbling thunder. I was starting to regret my decision to pick up this stranger. The atmosphere in the car felt tense and awkward. Suddenly Tom spoke up. "They're after me, I glanced over at him, startled. "What? Who's after you?" "Them," he said, his eyes darting around nervously. "The ones who are always watching, always listening." A chill ran down my spine. This guy was clearly not all there. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, wishing I could somehow put more distance between us in the confined space of the car. "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about," I said carefully. "We'll be in town soon and you can—" "No!" Tom interrupted sharply. "You don't understand. They're everywhere, in the walls, in our heads, always plotting." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Look, man, I think you're just stressed from being out in the storm. Why don't we—" "Stop the car," Tom demanded. "What? I can't stop here. We're in the middle of nowhere," I protested. "I said stop the car," he shouted, grabbing my arm roughly. Panic surged through me. I jerked away from his grip, causing the car to swerve on the wet road. "Hey, let go of me!" Tom's eyes were wild now. "You're one of them, aren't you? I should have known. You're all in on it." My heart was racing. I had to get this lunatic out of my car. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to help you out. Now please, calm down." Without warning, Tom lunged at me, grabbing the steering wheel. The car veered sharply to the right. I fought to regain control as we careened toward the ditch. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "You're going to get us killed." But Tom was beyond reason now. He was shouting incoherently about conspiracies and traitors. I desperately tried to pry his hands off the wheel, but he was unnaturally strong in his manic state. Everything happened in a blur after that. The car hit the soft shoulder and started to spin. I saw a flash of trees, heard the screech of metal, felt the sickening lurch as we rolled. Then everything went black. I'm not sure how long I was out. When I came to, the first thing I registered was the sound of rain pattering on metal. My head was throbbing and I tasted blood in my mouth. Slowly, I opened my eyes and tried to orient myself. The car was on its side in the ditch. Miraculously, my seat belt had held, and I was still in the driver's seat, albeit at a 90-degree angle. Water was starting to seep in through the cracked windshield. Then I remembered Tom. I looked over to the passenger side in a panic, but the seat was empty. The door on that side was hanging open. A wave of terror washed over me. He was out there somewhere, injured and clearly deranged. I had to get out of here. With shaking hands, I managed to unbuckle my seatbelt and clamber out through the driver's side window. The rain was still coming down in torrents. I stood there for a moment, swaying on unsteady legs as I tried to get my bearings. The road stretched out in both directions, empty and dark. There was no sign of Tom or any other cars, just an endless curtain of rain. I knew I couldn't stay here. Tom could return at any moment, and I didn't want to find out what he might do in his delusional state. My only option was to start walking and hope I reached town or flagged down help before he found me. So I set off down the road, limping slightly from the crash. Every few steps I glanced behind me, terrified I would see Tom's crazed face emerging from the darkness. The rain soaked through my clothes within minutes, but I barely noticed. I was running on pure adrenaline and fear. I'm not sure how long I walked. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes or so. My clothes were plastered to my skin, and I was shivering uncontrollably. But I didn't dare stop moving. Finally, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, praying they would see me. To my immense relief, the car slowed and pulled over. It was an older couple who lived nearby. They were shocked to find me stumbling down the road in the middle of the night. I gave them a rushed explanation about the accident, leaving out the details about Tom. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me or would insist on going back to check on him. They kindly drove me to the nearest police station, where I gave a full report of what happened. The officers were skeptical at first, but became more concerned when they couldn't find any record of a Tom matching my description in their database. They sent out search parties to look for Tom and my wrecked car, but found no trace of either. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing in some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the cuts and bruises from the crash were very real. It's been several months now, and I still lie awake at night replaying that terrifying encounter. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to make sense of it. Who was Tom really? What had happened to make him so paranoid and unstable? And where did he disappear to? I may never know the answers, but one thing's for certain. I'll never pick up another hitchhiker as long as I live. The memory of those wild eyes and grasping hands in the stormy darkness will haunt me forever. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I still find myself obsessively checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Tom's face suddenly appear in the back seat. I know it's irrational, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, ready to finish what he started on that rain-soaked road. I only hope our paths never cross again. I was an avid fisherman, and I'd always dreamed of owning a cozy little cabin by the lake where I could escape on weekends and holidays. When I finally saved up enough to buy a modest place on the outskirts of town, I was thrilled. It wasn't much, just a small rustic cabin with the basics, but it was mine, and it was perfect for quiet getaways. One Friday evening in late October, I decided to head up to the cabin for some solitary fishing. The weather forecast called for heavy rain, but I figured I could still get some good fishing in between storms. As I drove the winding forest road in the growing darkness, the rain started coming down in sheets. By the time I reached the cabin, it was a full-on deluge. I hurried inside, soaked to the bone, and got a fire going in the old wood stove. As I was hanging up my dripping raincoat, I heard what sounded like frantic pounding on the door. Startled, I cautiously approached and called out, "Who's there?" A woman's voice, high and panicked, cried, "Please help me, let me in." I hesitated for just a moment before throwing open the door. There on my porch stood a young woman, drenched and shivering violently. Her clothes were torn and muddy, and her eyes were wide with terror. "Oh, thank God," she gasped. "Please, I need help. Can I come in?" "Of course," I said, ushering her inside. "What happened? Are you all right?" As soon as she crossed the threshold, she collapsed to her knees, sobbing. I knelt beside her, unsure what to do. "It's okay. You're safe now," I said awkwardly. "Let's get you warmed up." I grabbed a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She clutched it tightly, still shaking. Thank you," she stammered through chattering teeth. "I'm John," I said gently. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered. "Okay, Emily, let's get you by the fire to warm up. Can you stand?" She nodded weakly, and I helped her to her feet. As we walked to the wood stove, I noticed she was limping badly. "You're hurt," I said. "What happened out there?" Emily sank down in front of the fire, pulling the blanket tighter. I escaped," she said in a quavering voice. "He had me locked up for days. I finally got away tonight, but he chased me through the woods. I've been running for hours. I thought he was going to catch me." A chill ran down my spine. Who had you locked up?" She shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know his name. He grabbed me off the street 4 days ago, drugged me and threw me in his car. When I woke up, I was chained up in some kind of cellar or basement." My mind reeled, trying to process what she was telling me. "My God," I breathed. "We need to call the police right away." I started to stand, but Emily grabbed my arm. "No, please, not yet. He might be out there still. If he sees police lights—" She broke off with a strangled sob. Okay, I said, trying to stay calm. "We'll wait a bit. Let's get you into some dry clothes first. I have some sweats that might fit you." I rummaged through my duffel bag and found an old sweatshirt and pants. "Here, you can change in the bathroom. There are towels in there, too." Emily nodded gratefully and limped to the small bathroom. While she changed, I paced nervously, peering out the windows into the rainy darkness. What if her captor really was out there? Should I get my hunting rifle just in case? A few minutes later, Emily emerged looking marginally better in the dry clothes. Her face was still pale and drawn, but some of the terror had faded from her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found your cabin." "Of course," I replied. "I'm just glad I was here. Are you hungry? I can heat up some soup." She nodded. "That would be wonderful. I haven't eaten much in days." As I busied myself in the kitchenette, Emily settled back by the fire. I could feel her watching me. "So, what exactly happened?" I asked hesitantly. "I mean, if you want to talk about it, no pressure." Emily was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was walking home from work, same as always. It was getting dark. This van pulled up beside me and a man asked for directions. When I stopped to help, he grabbed me and shoved me inside. There was another man waiting. They injected me with something and I blacked out." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. I waited silently, soup forgotten. When I woke up, I was chained to a bed in this dark, damp room. I think it was underground. There were no windows. I could hear them talking sometimes, but I never saw their faces. They always wore masks when they came in. Emily's voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. I felt sick to my stomach imagining what she must have endured. "You don't have to say any more," I said gently. She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Anyway, tonight they forgot to lock the door properly. As soon as I realized, I managed to slip out of the chains and run. I have no idea where I am or how far I've come. I just ran and ran until I saw your lights." We sat in heavy silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and pounding rain outside. I tried to wrap my head around Emily's horrific story. How could something like this happen? Suddenly, Emily tensed. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened intently, but heard nothing over the storm. "Hear what?" "A car," she said, eyes wide with renewed panic. "I swear I heard a car engine. Now I heard it too. the distant rumble of a vehicle on the access road. Emily scrambled to her feet. "Oh God, it's him. He found me." "Hey, it's okay," I said, trying to project calm I didn't feel. "It's probably just someone who took a wrong turn. Let me check." Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peered out into the rainy night. After a moment, I saw headlights appear through the trees, moving slowly down the road towards the cabin. "There is a car," I said, "but it could be anyone. Let's not panic." Emily was hyperventilating. No, it has to be him. He's going to take me back there." I grabbed my phone. "I'm calling the police, right now." But there was no signal. Of course, the storm must have knocked out the cell towers. The car was getting closer. I could see now that it was a dark-colored SUV. It slowed to a crawl as it approached the cabin. "Quick, hide in the bathroom," I told Emily. "Lock the door. I'll get rid of them." She hesitated for just a moment before darting into the bathroom. I heard the lock click into place. The SUV pulled up in front of the cabin and stopped, headlights glaring through the windows. My mouth went dry as I saw a large figure emerge from the driver's side. Heavy footsteps on the porch, then a forceful knock that seemed to rattle the whole cabin. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" I called out. A man's gruff voice replied, "Sorry to bother you so late. I'm looking for my daughter. She ran away and I'm worried sick. Have you seen anyone out here tonight?" My mind raced. Could this actually be Emily's father? Or was it her captor spinning a lie? "No, sorry," I said. "I haven't seen anyone. Just got here myself a little while ago." The man sighed heavily. "All right, thanks anyway. If you do see a young woman out here, please call the sheriff. Her mother and I are beside ourselves." "Of course," I replied. "I hope you find her." The man trudged back to his vehicle. I watched as the SUV slowly reversed and drove back the way it had come, taillights disappearing into the rainy night. I sagged against the door in relief. After a few minutes, I knocked softly on the bathroom door. "It's okay, Emily. They're gone." She emerged, trembling. "Was it him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "He said he was looking for his runaway daughter, but I didn't let him in or tell him you were here, just in case." Emily nodded. "Thank you. I'm sorry to put you in danger like this." "Don't apologize," I said. "I'm glad I could help. Look, why don't you try to get some sleep? You can take the bed. I'll sleep out here. We'll go to the police station first thing in the morning." She agreed gratefully. I gave her some extra blankets and she curled up in my small bedroom. I settled onto the lumpy couch, but sleep was impossible. My mind kept spinning with questions and doubts. Had I done the right thing? What if that really was her father, but what if it wasn't? The night crawled by. Every creak of the cabin and gust of wind made me start, but no one else came, and eventually the storm began to subside. As dawn broke, Emily emerged from the bedroom looking exhausted, but calmer. "Ready to go to the police?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes, and thank you again for everything. I don't know how to repay you." "No need," I said. "I'm just glad you're safe." We drove to the nearest town, and I dropped Emily off at the sheriff's station. She gave me a quick hug before hurrying inside. I waited for a while, but no one came out to question me. Eventually, I headed home, my fishing trip forgotten. In the days and weeks that followed, I scoured the local news for any mention of Emily's story. But there was nothing. No reports of rescued kidnapping victims, no arrests of kidnappers. I drove by the sheriff's station a couple times, working up the nerve to inquire about her, but always lost my courage at the last minute. To this day, I don't know what became of Emily or if her story was even true. But on dark, stormy nights, I still sometimes imagine I hear frantic knocking at my cabin door Around 11 p.m., I was sitting at my desk filling out some paperwork when I heard frantic knocking at the door. Startled, I got up to investigate. Who could possibly be out in this weather? As I approached the entrance, I could make out the silhouette of a man through the rain-streaked glass. I opened the door and was immediately blasted by wind and rain. There stood a tall, thin man, completely drenched from head to toe. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes had a wild, desperate look. "Please, I need help," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "My car broke down on the access road, and I've been walking for hours trying to find shelter. Can I please come in?" I hesitated for a moment. It wasn't standard procedure to let strangers into the station, especially at night. But one look at the man's pathetic, shivering state, and I knew I couldn't turn him away. What kind of ranger would I be if I left someone to fend for themselves in this weather? "Of course, come in quickly," I said, ushering him inside. As soon as I closed the door, blessed silence fell over us, broken only by the muffled sounds of rain and thunder. The man stood there dripping, creating a puddle on the floor. Now that I could see him clearly in the light, I noticed he was wearing muddy jeans and a torn jacket. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that darted around the room. "Thank you so much," he said, his teeth chattering. "I thought I was going to die out there." "Let me get you a towel and some dry clothes," I offered. "There's a small kitchen area through that door if you want to make yourself some coffee to warm up." He nodded gratefully, and I went to grab some supplies. When I returned with a towel and an old ranger uniform we kept for emergencies, the man was standing in the exact same spot, still as a statue. "Here you go," I said, handing him the items. "The bathroom's just down the hall if you want to change." He took the clothes wordlessly and disappeared into the bathroom. While he was gone, I busied myself making a pot of coffee. I had a nagging feeling of unease, but I chalked it up to the stressful situation and ominous weather. A few minutes later, the man emerged wearing the dry uniform. It was a bit big on his lanky frame, but at least he wasn't soaked anymore. He accepted the mug of coffee I offered with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Thomas, by the way," I said, trying to break the awkward silence. "John," he replied simply, taking a sip of coffee. "So, John, you said your car broke down? Where exactly were you headed this late at night in such bad weather?" He paused before answering. "I was on my way to visit my sick mother. She lives in the next town over." Something about his tone seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I decided to keep the conversation going, hoping it would put us both more at ease. "Well, the storm should pass by morning. I can give you a ride into town then, and we can get a tow truck for your car." John nodded absently, his eyes roaming around the room. "This is quite an isolated location," he remarked. "Do you work here alone?" "Usually, yeah," I replied. "It's just me on the night shift." He murmured. "That must get lonely, and a little scary sometimes, I'd imagine." I chuckled nervously. "It can be, but you get used to it. Plus, we have radio communication with other stations and law enforcement if needed." John's eyes snapped to mine at that. "Oh, so you can easily call for help if there's trouble?" A chill ran down my spine at his words and the intensity of his gaze. I tried to keep my voice steady as I answered. "That's right. We're well prepared for any situation out here." He set down his mug and began slowly pacing the room, examining the maps and equipment on the walls. "Fascinating. You must know these woods like the back of your hand." "I suppose so," I said cautiously. "Been working here a long time." John stopped in front of a locked cabinet. "What's in here?" he asked, jiggling the handle. "Just some supplies," I lied. It actually contained our firearms and other weapons. He turned to face me, a strange glint in his eye. You know, I've always been fascinated by guns. Do rangers carry them? My heart started racing. This conversation was taking a very alarming turn. Sometimes, for animal control situations, I said vaguely. Listen, John, it's getting late. Why don't I show you to the bunk room where you can get some sleep? John ignored me, continuing to circle the room like a predator stalking its prey. It must be so peaceful out here most of the time. Just you alone with nature, no one around for miles. I stood up, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Yes, well, like I said, it's late. We should both get some rest. In one fluid motion, John whipped around and lunged at me, a gleaming knife suddenly in his hand. I barely managed to dodge the blade, feeling it whistle past my ear. What the hell? I shouted, stumbling backwards. John advanced on me, a maniacal grin spreading across his face. Oh, Thomas, you've been so helpful, but I'm afraid our little chat is over now. Pure adrenaline coursed through me as I grabbed a chair and held it in front of me like a shield. Stay back. What do you want? He laughed, a chilling sound. What do I want? I want to hunt the most dangerous game of all, man. And you, my friend, are going to be my prey tonight. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this nightmare. The radio was across the room. No way to reach it without John catching me. Same for my cell phone on the desk. I feinted to the left, then darted right, trying to make it to the door. But John was faster than he looked. He caught me by the back of my shirt, yanking me off balance. I crashed to the floor, the wind knocked out of me. Before I could recover, John was on top of me, pinning me down. The knife glinted in the fluorescent lights as he raised it above his head. I grabbed his wrist with both hands, straining with all my might to keep the blade from plunging into my chest. For what felt like an eternity, we struggled there on the floor. John was surprisingly strong, the knife inching closer and closer despite my efforts. I could feel my arms shaking from exertion. Just as my strength was about to give out, a particularly loud crack of thunder startled us both. John's grip loosened for a split second, but it was enough. I managed to wrench the knife from his grasp and slash wildly at his face. He reeled back with a howl of pain, blood streaming from a gash across his cheek. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the door, fumbling with the lock with trembling hands. I burst out into the raging storm, the wind and rain instantly soaking me to the bone. But I didn't stop. I ran blindly into the dark forest, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I had no idea where I was going or how long I ran. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but terror kept me moving. Eventually I stumbled upon one of our hiking trails and followed it until I reached another smaller outpost we used during busy seasons. Collapsing inside, I immediately grabbed the emergency radio and called for help. Within an hour, police and other rangers had swarmed the area, but there was no sign of John. He had vanished into the night like a ghost. In the days that followed, I learned that there had been a string of mysterious disappearances in the region over the past few months. Hikers and campers who had gone into the woods and never returned. The police believe John may have been responsible, using the storm as cover for his twisted hunt. It's been weeks now, but I still have nightmares about that night. I jump at every shadow and loud noise. I've taken a leave of absence from work. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back to that station. The forest I once loved now feels like a sinister, dangerous place. Worst of all is the lingering fear that John is still out there somewhere, waiting for his next opportunity to strike. I can't shake the feeling that our paths may cross again someday, and next time I might not be so lucky. Around 11 p.m., I was restocking the cigarette display when I heard the bell ding. A sleek black Audi pulled up to pump 3, its tinted windows gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Something about it seemed off right away. Most folks around here drive pickup trucks or beat-up sedans, not luxury German cars. I watched as the driver got out, a tall figure in a dark coat and hat. They kept their head down, obscuring their face. My skin prickled. There was something unnatural about their movements, too fluid and precise. They came inside and approached the counter. I still couldn't make out any features beneath the hat brim. When they spoke, the voice was oddly flat and genderless. "Pack of Marlboro Reds, please." I grabbed the cigarettes, my hand trembling slightly as I set them on the counter. "That'll be $8.50. A gloved hand placed a crisp $100 bill down. As I counted out change, they spoke again. "I need you to check the tire pressure." I hesitated. We didn't usually do that this late, but I didn't want to refuse. "Sure, I can take a look." Outside, I knelt by the Audi's tires. The whole car emanated a faint hum, like electricity. When I touched the tire, a shock ran up my arm. I yelped and stumbled back. The figure was suddenly beside me. I hadn't heard them approach. "Everything all right?" That emotionless voice again. Yeah, just static, I guess. Tires look good." Back inside, I tried to calm my racing heart. The customer lingered, browsing snacks with eerie stillness. Minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. They bought nothing else, just stood there. I kept glancing over, growing more uneasy. At 1 a.m. they finally returned to the counter. I braced myself. "One more thing," they said. "I need you to deliver a message." My mouth went dry. "A message?" They leaned in close. I caught a whiff of ozone. "Tell them it's done." "Tell who? What's done?" I stammered. But they were already walking out. The Audi's engine roared to life, and it peeled away into the night, leaving me alone with those cryptic words echoing in my head. The rest of my shift passed in a daze. I kept replaying every detail, trying to make sense of it. Who was that person? What had they done? And who was I supposed to tell? When my replacement arrived at 6 a.m., I briefly considered telling him about the strange encounter, but it all seemed so unreal in the harsh light of morning. I decided to keep it to myself. On the drive home, every black car I passed made me flinch. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that Audi following me. I tried to convince myself it was just some weirdo playing mind games, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Something I'd gotten caught up in without realizing. For weeks after, I jumped at every sound. Customers with hats made me break out in a cold sweat. I kept waiting for someone to approach me, to ask about the message, but nothing happened. Gradually, life returned to normal. I started to doubt my own memory of that night. Maybe I dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. Then, exactly 1 month later, I was locking up the station when I noticed something on the door. A small symbol had been etched into the glass, a circle with a line through it. My blood ran cold. Somehow, I knew it was connected to that night. A warning? A threat? I had no idea. But one thing was clear. Whatever had been done that night, it wasn't over. I quit my job the next day, packed up and moved in with my sister 2 states over. I never told anyone the full story, until now. Writing this out, I can feel that old fear creeping back. Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder to figure out what it all meant. To warn someone, maybe. But mostly, I'm just grateful to have walked away, because I'm convinced that whoever, or whatever, visited the station that night wasn't human. And whatever plan they set in motion, I want no part of it. So if you're reading this and you ever find yourself working a lonely night shift, be careful. Be very careful who you talk to, and if a black Audi pulls up, run. I had been driving for about 6 hours already, and it was getting close to 2 a.m. The streets were mostly empty at that point, just the occasional drunk stumbling home from a bar. I was thinking about calling it a night when I got a ping for a pickup downtown. As I pulled up to the address, I saw a tall man in a crisp black suit standing on the curb. He climbed into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but I could see he had sharp, angular features and cold gray eyes that seemed to stare right through me. "Just drive," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "I'll give you directions as we go." Something about his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't exactly refuse a fare, so I pulled away from the curb and started driving. For the next 30 minutes, the man in the back seat directed me through a series of turns, taking us further and further away from the city center. We were heading out into more rural areas I wasn't as familiar with. The streetlights became fewer and farther between until we were driving down dark country roads with nothing but my headlights illuminating the way. I was getting more and more uneasy. Where the hell was this guy taking us? I cleared my throat nervously. Sir, we're getting pretty far out of my usual area. I'm not sure I'll be able to find my way back from here." "Keep driving," he growled. There was a threatening edge to his voice that made me shut up immediately. After what felt like hours of driving down winding back roads, he finally told me to pull over onto a dirt path leading into some woods. By this point, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I had no idea where we were, my phone had lost signal long ago, and I was alone with this menacing stranger in the middle of nowhere. "Get out," he ordered as I brought the car to a stop. My heart was pounding. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. Just pay your fare and I'll head back to—" In one swift motion, he leaned forward and pressed something cold and metallic against the back of my head. A gun. Oh, God. I said get out, now. I scrambled out of the car, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. The man got out as well, keeping the gun trained on me. "Open the trunk," he said. With trembling hands, I popped the trunk. The man reached in and pulled out a shovel I kept back there for emergencies. He tossed it at my feet. "Start digging. Right here." Please," I stammered. "I don't know what you want, but I swear I won't say anything. Just let me go." He cocked the gun. "Dig, or I'll put a bullet in your skull and do it myself." Choking back a sob, I picked up the shovel and started digging. The only sounds were my labored breathing and the scrape of metal on dirt. After about 20 minutes of frantic digging, I had excavated a hole about 4 feet deep. "That's enough," the man said. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a black garbage bag. It was about the size of a basketball and seemed to be full of something heavy. My mind was racing, imagining what could be in that bag. A severed head, stolen money, drugs. Whatever it was, I knew I was about to become an unwilling accessory to some serious crime. The man tossed the bag into the hole. "Fill it in," he ordered. With shaking arms, I shoveled the dirt back over the mysterious package, burying it deep in the earth. When I was done, the man made me smooth out the dirt and spread leaves and branches over the disturbed ground to disguise it. "Listen carefully," he said when I had finished. "You're going to get back in your car and drive away. You're going to forget this ever happened. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, the police, your family, anyone, I will find out, and I will find you. Do you understand?" I nodded frantically, too terrified to speak. "Good. Now go." I practically dove back into my taxi and peeled out of there as fast as I could. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man standing there watching me leave, his tall silhouette etched against the pre-dawn sky. It took me over 2 hours of aimless, panicked driving to find my way back to familiar roads. By the time I made it home, the sun was coming up. I stumbled into my apartment, locked every door and window, and collapsed into bed fully clothed. For days afterward, I was a nervous wreck. I kept expecting the police to show up at my door, or for that man to reappear in my back seat. I couldn't sleep, barely ate, and jumped at every unexpected sound. I considered going to the police multiple times, but the man's threat kept echoing in my head. What if he found out? What would he do to me? I ended up quitting my job as a taxi driver. I couldn't handle the anxiety of picking up strangers anymore. Even now, years later, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time I see a tall man in a dark suit, my heart starts racing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. It seems too surreal to have actually happened. But then I'll have a vivid flashback of digging that hole in the woods, of the weight of that mysterious bag as I covered it with dirt. And I know it was real. I don't know what I buried that night. Part of me never wants to know. But whatever it was, that secret is out there somewhere, hidden in the ground. And the memory of it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was just wrapping up my shift at the factory when I noticed something odd. Jim, my co-worker who'd been acting strange lately, was hunched over the main control panel, furtively pressing buttons and adjusting dials. A chill ran down my spine. He shouldn't have been anywhere near those controls. "Jim?" I called out hesitantly. He jumped and spun around, eyes wide with panic. "What are you doing?" "Laura, I was just," he stammered, frantically trying to block the panel from view. But it was too late. I'd already seen enough to know something was very wrong. I'd worked at Midwest Manufacturing for nearly a decade, operating the massive industrial machinery that churned out auto parts day and night. The control panel Jim had been messing with regulated core functions across the entire factory floor. One wrong move could spell disaster. "Step away from the controls," I said firmly, my heart pounding. "Now." Jim's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Fine," he muttered, "but you don't understand. I had to do something." As he moved aside, I rushed to examine the panel. My blood ran cold as I saw the settings had been drastically altered, safety protocols overridden, fail-safes disabled. If production had started up like this— "Are you insane?" I hissed. "You could have killed someone. What were you thinking?" Jim's face contorted with a mix of shame and anger. "I was thinking maybe management would finally pay attention if something went wrong. Do you have any idea how many times I've reported safety issues only to be brushed off?" I stared at him in disbelief. Jim had always been passionate about workplace safety, constantly pushing for upgrades and improvements. But this was a whole new level of reckless. "So your solution was to intentionally cause an accident?" I asked incredulously. "Not a big one," Jim protested. "Just enough to wake them up, make them see how serious this is. The bearings on the main assembly line are on the verge of failure. The emergency shutoffs on the hydraulic presses keep malfunctioning. But does anyone listen? No." I could hear the frustration in his voice, and part of me understood. We'd all seen management drag their feet on repairs and maintenance, but sabotaging equipment was beyond the pale. "Jim, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I get that you're frustrated. We all are. But this isn't the way. You could have seriously hurt someone, or worse." He deflated, the fight going out of him. I know. I don't know what I was thinking. I just felt so powerless. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through me. Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, you're going to reverse every change you made. Then we're going straight to Mike and telling him everything. Jim blanched. Mike? The supervisor? But I'll be fired for sure. Maybe, I conceded, but it's better than living with blood on your hands if something had gone wrong. And who knows, maybe this will finally make them take the safety concerns seriously. For a tense moment, I thought Jim might refuse, but then he nodded glumly and turned back to the control panel. I watched like a hawk as he methodically undid his sabotage, triple-checking that every setting was back to normal. As we walked to Mike's office, my mind raced. How close had we come to disaster? What if I hadn't noticed Jim acting suspicious? The thought made me feel sick. Mike's face grew increasingly grim as we laid out the whole story. By the end, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. Jesus Christ, he muttered, running a hand over his face. Jim, I don't even know where to start. You realize I have no choice but to terminate your employment, right? Jim nodded miserably. I understand. I'm so sorry. I never meant... Mike held up a hand to cut him off. Save it. HR will be in touch about the details of your separation. For now, I need you to leave the premises immediately. As Jim slunk out, Mike turned to me with a weary sigh. Laura, I can't thank you enough for catching this. You may well have saved lives today. I shifted uncomfortably. I'm just glad I noticed in time. But, sir, Jim wasn't entirely wrong about the safety issues. I know budgets are tight, but some of this equipment desperately needs attention. Mike was quiet for a long moment. You're right, he finally said. This is the wake-up call we needed. I'm going to push hard for a full safety audit and necessary upgrades. It shouldn't have taken something like this, but, well, here we are. I left Mike's office in a daze, my emotions a tangled mess. Relief that disaster had been averted warred with lingering fear over how close we'd come. Anger at Jim's recklessness mingled with sympathy for his frustration. And underneath it all, a gnawing anxiety. How safe were we really? The next few weeks were a whirlwind. True to his word, Mike initiated a top-to-bottom review of safety protocols and equipment conditions. Outside consultants were brought in, and suddenly the repairs and upgrades that had been endlessly deferred were getting fast-tracked. But even as I saw positive changes happening, I couldn't shake the unease that had taken root that day. Every time I walked onto the factory floor, I found myself eyeing the machinery warily, imagining worst-case scenarios. The deep thrumming of the assembly line that had once been background noise now set my teeth on edge. My co-workers noticed the change in me. You okay, Laura? They'd ask. You seem jumpy lately. I'd force a smile and brush it off. How could I explain the nightmares that plagued me? The visions of mangled bodies and twisted metal, of alarms blaring as chaos engulfed the factory floor. They hadn't seen what Jim almost did. They didn't know how close we'd come. As the days passed, I found myself struggling to focus on my work. My hands would shake as I operated the machinery, every unexpected sound making me flinch. More than once, I caught myself obsessively checking and rechecking safety settings, terrified I'd missed something critical. I knew I should probably talk to someone, a therapist maybe. But the thought of trying to explain it all to an outsider was exhausting. How could they understand the weight of responsibility I felt, the gnawing fear that next time I might not catch the problem in time? About a month after the incident, I was working the night shift when a bearing seized up on one of the conveyor belts. The screech of metal on metal filled the air, and for one heart-stopping moment, I was sure this was it. The disaster we'd narrowly avoided was finally happening, but the emergency systems kicked in flawlessly, shutting down the line before any real damage could occur. As my co-workers bustled about, assessing the situation and calling for maintenance, I found myself rooted to the spot, trembling. "You all right there, Laura?" called out Derek, one of the newer hires. "Looks like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I tell him that in that moment of panic, I'd been sure I was about to witness horrific carnage? That part of me was still braced for alarms and screams. Derek must have seen something in my face, because his jovial expression softened into concern. "Hey, why don't you take a breather? We've got this covered." I nodded gratefully and stumbled outside, gulping in the cool night air. As my racing heart slowly steadied, I found myself facing an uncomfortable truth. I couldn't go on like this. The constant state of hypervigilance was wearing me down, affecting my work and my sanity. But what were my options? I loved my job, or at least I had before all this. The thought of walking away from a decade of experience and seniority was daunting. And yet, could I really spend the rest of my career jumping at shadows, perpetually braced for disaster? As I stood there under the stars, grappling with my fears and uncertainties, I realized there were no easy answers. The events of that day had shaken me to my core, forcing me to confront the fragility of safety and the weight of responsibility in ways I never had before. I didn't know what the future held, whether I'd find a way to make peace with what had happened, or if I'd ultimately need to make a drastic change. But I did know one thing: I'd never again take workplace safety for granted. The memory of Jim, hunched over that control panel, seconds away from catastrophe, would stay with me forever, a chilling reminder of how quickly things can go wrong and how vigilant we must be to prevent it. As I finally turned to head back inside, I made a silent promise to myself. Whatever path I chose going forward, I would do everything in my power to ensure that no one else ever had to experience the fear and uncertainty that now haunted me. It was a heavy burden, but one I knew I had to bear, because some lessons once learned can never be unlearned, and the price of complacency is far too high. I heard the back door creak open and assumed it was Miguel coming in early for his shift. "Hey man, you're here, I started to call out, but the words died in my throat as I turned and saw who had actually entered. It was Jake, our former line cook who'd been fired a few weeks back for showing up drunk. But this wasn't the Jake I remembered. His eyes were wild, his clothes disheveled, and in his shaking hand was a large kitchen knife. My heart started pounding as Jake stumbled towards me. "You," he slurred, pointing the knife in my direction. "You're the reason I lost my job." I held up my hands, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jake, calm down, man. I had nothing to do with that. Why don't we talk about this?" But Jake wasn't listening. He lunged forward, swinging the knife wildly. I barely managed to dodge, feeling the blade whistle past my ear. Panic surged through me as I realized this was real. Jake was actually trying to kill me. I scrambled backwards, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. Jake kept coming, a crazed look in his eyes. "I'm gonna make you pay," he shouted, slashing at me again. My back hit the stove, and I felt around desperately, my hand closing on the handle of a cast-iron skillet. Without thinking, I swung it with all my might, just as Jake lunged again. There was a sickening crack as the pan connected with Jake's skull. He crumpled to the floor, the knife clattering away. For a moment, I stood frozen, the skillet still gripped tightly in my trembling hands. Was he dead? Had I just killed a man? A low groan from Jake snapped me back to reality. He was alive, but clearly dazed. I knew I only had moments before he might get up again. Dropping the skillet, I sprinted for the office where we kept the phone. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial 911. Please, I stammered when the operator answered. There's been an attack at the Denny's on 5th Street. Please hurry. The next few minutes were a blur. I locked myself in the office, listening for any sound of Jake getting up. When I heard sirens approaching, relief washed over me. But even as the police arrived and took Jake into custody, I couldn't stop shaking. The rest of the night passed in a haze of police statements and crime scene texts. I must have told my story a dozen times. How Jake had shown up unexpectedly, how he'd come at me with the knife, how I'd managed to fight him off with the skillet. Each time I recounted it, it felt less real, like I was describing a movie I'd seen rather than something that had actually happened to me. When the sun finally rose, I found myself sitting on the curb outside the restaurant, a shock blanket draped over my shoulders. One of the detectives approached, notepad in hand. "We've got Jake in custody," he informed me. "He's facing charges of breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted murder. You're lucky you managed to defend yourself." I nodded numbly, still struggling to process everything. What's going to happen now?" I asked. The detective's expression softened slightly. "We'll need you to come down to the station later to give a formal statement. But for now, I'd recommend going home and getting some rest. Do you have someone who can stay with you?" I thought about my roommate, probably still fast asleep and unaware of the nightmare I'd just lived through. "Yeah," I mumbled. "I've got someone." As I waited for my Uber to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling of unreality that had settled over me. Just a few hours ago, this had been my normal workplace, a place where the biggest worry was dealing with drunk customers or messing up an order. Now, it felt alien and threatening. The cheerful Denny's sign overhead seemed to mock the violence that had unfolded inside. The days that followed were a struggle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake lunging at me with that knife. The sound of the skillet connecting with his skull played on repeat in my mind. I jumped at every unexpected noise, convinced that somehow Jake had escaped and was coming to finish what he'd started. My manager called, asking when I'd be ready to come back to work. The thought of returning to that kitchen made me physically ill. I stammered out some excuse about needing more time, but we both knew the truth. I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to go back. Nightmares plagued my sleep. In them, I was always back in that kitchen, but this time the skillet would slip from my grasp, or Jake would be too quick for me. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the phantom pain of a knife in my gut lingering even in the waking world. My friends tried to be supportive, but I could see the concern in their eyes. "You need to talk to someone," my roommate urged after the third night of hearing me scream myself awake. "This isn't healthy, man." I knew he was right, but the thought of reliving that night with a stranger felt impossible. How could I explain the sheer terror of those moments, the way time seemed to slow down as Jake swung that knife at me? How could I make anyone understand the guilt I felt for hurting him, even though I knew I had no choice? Weeks passed, and slowly the raw edge of fear began to dull. I still couldn't bring myself to quit my job officially. It felt like admitting defeat, like letting Jake win somehow. But I knew I'd never flip another pancake or wipe down another counter without seeing his face. One day, I forced myself to drive past the Denny's. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I approached, half expecting to see Jake's ghost in the window. But it was just a restaurant, families eating breakfast, waitresses bustling about. Life had moved on, even if I felt stuck in that moment. As I sat at a red light, staring at the place that had become the setting of my personal horror movie, a realization slowly dawned on me. The world hadn't changed that night. I had. The sense of safety I'd taken for granted had been shattered, leaving me to navigate a reality where danger could lurk in the most mundane places. I wish I could say there was some grand epiphany, some moment where I conquered my fears and everything went back to normal. But that's not how trauma works. Recovery, I've learned, is a slow and often frustrating process. Some days are better than others. I still have nightmares, still flinch at unexpected movements. But I'm trying to reclaim my life, one small step at a time. I don't know if I'll ever fully shake the memory of that night. The sound of that skillet connecting, the wild look in Jake's eyes, those things are seared into my brain. But I'm learning to live with it, to recognize that one terrifying experience doesn't define my entire existence. Sometimes, when I pass a Denny's or catch a whiff of breakfast food, I'm transported back to that kitchen. For a moment, I'm that terrified guy again, fighting for his life with a cast-iron skillet. But then I take a deep breath, reminding myself that I survived. I'm still here, still moving forward. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe someday I'll be able to work in a restaurant again without my heart racing. Maybe I'll always carry this fear with me. But I'm determined not to let that night be the end of my story. It's a chapter, a dark and terrifying one, to be sure, but not the whole book. So I keep going, one day at a time. And if nothing else, I've gained a newfound respect for the humble cast-iron skillet. You never know when it might just save your life. The building was always eerily quiet at night. Rows of empty cubicles and darkened conference rooms stretched out before me as I made my rounds, pushing my cleaning cart down the dimly lit hallways. The only sounds were the hum of the air conditioning and the squeak of my shoes on the polished floors. I'd been working here for nearly 15 years, and I knew every nook and cranny of this place. Or at least I thought I did. That night, something felt off. I can't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I unlocked the door to the 7th floor. As I flicked on the lights, my eyes were drawn to Suite 704 at the end of the hall. It had been vacant for months since some tech startup went under. But tonight, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement through the frosted glass door. I tried to shake it off, probably just my imagination playing tricks on me after too many late nights. Still, I couldn't quite push away the feeling of unease as I went about my usual cleaning routine. An hour later, I was just finishing up mopping the break room when I heard it, a muffled thump coming from down the hall. My heart started racing. I gripped the mop handle tightly, straining my ears. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then I heard it again, a definite sound, like something being knocked over. Every instinct told me to hightail it out of there and call security. But curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was going on in that empty office. Pulse pounding, I crept down the hallway toward Suite 704. As I got closer, I could make out faint rustling sounds from inside. Someone, or something, was definitely in there. With trembling hands, I pulled out my master key. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone in here?" Silence. Then a crash from the back of the office made me jump. I'm calling the police," I threatened, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. That's when I heard it, a quiet, desperate sob. It sounded human and utterly terrified. Against my better judgment, I inched further into the darkened office. As my eyes adjusted, I made out a hunched figure huddled in the corner behind an overturned file cabinet. "Please," a man's voice croaked. "Please don't hurt me. I have nowhere else to go." I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent light. There, curled up on the floor, was a man who looked to be in his 40s. His clothes were dirty and ragged, his face gaunt and unshaven. He shielded his eyes from the sudden brightness, looking up at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said, my voice softer now. "What are you doing in here?" The man's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. I lost my job a few months ago. Couldn't make rent. Been on the streets ever since. I found this empty office last week. Thought I could stay here for a while without bothering anyone. Please don't call the cops. I'll leave, I promise." My heart ached as I looked at this broken man before me. I'd seen plenty of homeless folks on my commute to work, but I'd never come face to face with someone in such dire straits before. "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Tom," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Dave," I said. "Listen, Tom, I can't just let you stay here. It's not safe or legal, but I want to help if I can." Tom nodded resignedly, struggling to his feet. That's when I noticed how thin he was, how his clothes hung off his frame. How long had it been since he'd had a proper meal? "When's the last time you ate?" I asked. Tom shrugged. "Couple days ago, maybe? Found some leftovers in a dumpster behind that Italian place down the street." I felt sick to my stomach. Here I was worrying about making my car payment, while this man was literally starving right under my nose. "Wait here," I told him. "I'll be right back." I hurried to the break room and grabbed some of the snacks I kept stashed in my locker. Granola bars, chips, a couple apples. When I returned, Tom's eyes lit up at the sight of food. He devoured it ravenously while I watched, unsure what to do next. I knew I should call the police. It was protocol for dealing with trespassers. But as I looked at Tom, this human being who had fallen on incredibly hard times, I couldn't bring myself to treat him like a criminal. "Tom," I said carefully, "I want to help you, but you can't stay here. Do you have any family or friends you can call?" He shook his head. "Burned all those bridges a long time ago," he said bitterly. "Look, I appreciate the food, but I'll get out of your hair now. Maybe I can find an alley to crash in or something." The thought of sending this man back out onto the cold streets made my chest tighten. There had to be a better option. "Hold on," I said, pulling out my phone. "Let me make a call." I stepped out into the hallway and dialed 311, the city's non-emergency line. After a brief wait, I got through to an operator and explained the situation. To my relief, she was sympathetic and gave me the number for a nearby homeless shelter that had space available. When I went back into the office, Tom looked at me warily. "Did you call the cops?" "No," I assured him. "But I did find a shelter that can take you in tonight. They've got beds, showers, hot meals. It's not much, but it's better than the streets. What do you say?" Tom's eyes welled up with tears. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Most people would have just called security and had me thrown out." I shrugged, suddenly feeling a bit awkward. "I guess. I just know how easily any of us could end up in your shoes. Life can change in an instant. We've all got to look out for each other, you know." Tom nodded, wiping his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. I don't know what else to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "Come on, let's get you somewhere safe for the night." I helped Tom gather what few belongings he had, just a ratty backpack and a worn blanket. As we headed for the elevator, I couldn't help but marvel at how quickly my ordinary night had turned into something so profound. The ride to the shelter was quiet. Tom stared out the window, lost in thought. I wondered about his story. What series of events had led him to this point? But I didn't pry. Everyone has their demons, their struggles. Tonight was about getting this man to safety, nothing more. When we pulled up to the shelter, a kind-faced woman greeted us at the door. She smiled warmly at Tom, assuring him they had a bed ready. As he turned to go inside, Tom paused and looked back at me. "Dave," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't forget this. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just some bum to be tossed aside. You've given me hope when I thought there was none left." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Take care of yourself, Tom," I managed to say. "And don't give up. Things can always get better." As I drove home that night, my mind was reeling. In the span of a few hours, my entire perspective had shifted. I thought about all the people I passed on the street without a second glance. How many of them had stories like Tom's? How many just needed someone to see them, to offer a helping hand? I knew I couldn't solve the world's problems, but that night showed me the profound impact one small act of kindness can have. It reminded me of our shared humanity and the responsibility we have to look out for one another. When I got home, I hugged my wife extra tight and said a silent prayer of gratitude for all I had. As I drifted off to sleep, I made a promise to myself to never again turn a blind eye to those in need, to remember that behind every struggling face is a human being worthy of compassion and dignity. That night changed me in ways I'm still discovering, and I'll always be grateful to Tom for opening my eyes to the hidden struggles happening all around us, if only we care enough to look. As I made my rounds, checking on patients and updating charts, I heard a faint sound coming from one of the closed wings. My first thought was that it was just the old building settling, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I paused, listening intently. There it was again, a soft shuffling noise, like footsteps. That wing had been closed for renovations for weeks. No one should be in there. I hesitated, debating whether to investigate or call security first. My curiosity got the better of me. I'd worked here long enough to handle most situations. I'd just take a quick look. I used my keycard to unlock the heavy doors leading into the closed wing. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, heavy, oppressive. My heart started racing as I moved slowly down the darkened hallway, straining my ears for any sound. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the hall ahead of me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared. "Is someone there?" No response, just more rustling sounds. I fumbled for my flashlight with shaking hands, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing empty rooms and debris from the renovations. As I swept the light back and forth, movement caught my eye. There, huddled in a corner, was a man. He was thin, disheveled, wearing what looked like tattered hospital scrubs. My blood ran cold as I recognized him, Peter Grayson, a former patient who'd been discharged months ago. He'd been diagnosed with severe schizophrenia and had a history of violent episodes during psychotic breaks. "Peter," I said cautiously, taking a step back. "What are you doing here? How did you get in?" His head snapped up at the sound of my voice, eyes wild and unfocused. "They're coming," he hissed, rocking back and forth. "I had to come back. It's the only safe place. They can't get me here." I raised my hands in what I hoped was a calming gesture. "It's okay, Peter. You're safe. Why don't we go somewhere more comfortable and talk about this?" He shook his head violently. "No, can't leave. They'll find me." His eyes darted around the room, seeing things I couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Who's coming, Peter?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no one here but us." "The shadows," he whispered. "They whisper. Tell me to do things. Bad things." He suddenly lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "You have to help me." I jerked back instinctively, dropping my flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam spinning crazily around the room. For a moment, everything was chaos. Flashing lights, Peter's ragged breathing, my own panicked gasps. As my eyes adjusted, I saw Peter had retreated back to his corner. He was muttering to himself now, having some kind of intense conversation with thin air. I knew I needed to get help, but I was afraid to turn my back on him. "Peter," I said softly, "I'm going to get someone to help us, okay? Just stay right there." His head snapped up again, eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me shudder. "No," he shouted. "You can't leave me alone with them." He sprang to his feet with surprising speed. Before I could react, he had me pinned against the wall, his face inches from mine. I could smell his sour breath, see the madness swirling in his eyes. "They'll make me hurt you," he growled. "I don't want to, but I can't stop them." Terror gripped me. I'd seen Peter during his violent episodes before, but I'd always been safely on the other side of a locked door. Now, trapped in this dark hallway with him, I realized how truly dangerous he could be. I tried to keep my voice calm, even as panic threatened to overwhelm me. "Peter, listen to me. No one is going to make you do anything. You're in control. Remember your coping strategies. Let's try some deep breaths together." For a moment, I thought it was working. His grip on my arms loosened slightly. Then his face contorted in pain and he stumbled back, clutching his head. "No, no, no," he moaned. "They're so loud. Make it stop." He began slamming his head against the wall. The sound of skull meeting concrete made me feel sick. I knew I had to act fast before he seriously hurt himself or me. I fumbled for the panic button on my lanyard, praying it would work in this closed-off section. To my immense relief, I heard the faint sound of alarms in the distance. Help was coming. Peter heard it too. He whirled on me, eyes blazing with paranoid fury. "You!" he snarled. "You brought them here!" He lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. I ducked under his outstretched arms and bolted down the hallway. I could hear him right behind me, his ragged breathing and pounding footsteps spurring me on. I burst through the doors into the main wing, nearly colliding with two security guards rushing towards the commotion. "In there!" I gasped, pointing back the way I'd come. "Peter Grayson, former patient, he's having an episode." The guards pushed past me, disappearing into the darkened wing. I slumped against the wall, trembling from head to toe as the adrenaline began to wear off. What felt like hours but was probably only minutes later, the guards emerged, half carrying a now sedated Peter between them. A team of nurses was waiting to escort him to a secure room for evaluation. As they passed, Peter's eyes flickered open, meeting mine. For just a second, I saw a flash of clarity there, fear, confusion, and overwhelming sadness. Then it was gone, replaced by the glassy-eyed stare of heavy sedation. I gave my statement to the head of security, explaining how I'd discovered Peter and what had transpired. They were baffled as to how he'd managed to get back into the hospital undetected. A full investigation would be launched, they assured me. By the time all the paperwork was done, my shift was nearly over. As I walked to my car in the pale light of dawn, I couldn't stop replaying the night's events in my mind. The terror I'd felt, trapped in that dark hallway with Peter, the sadness in his eyes in that brief moment of lucidity. I'd known this job could be dangerous. We had protocols and security measures in place for a reason, but I don't think I'd ever truly understood the risks until I was face to face with a patient in the grips of a psychotic episode. More than that, though, I couldn't shake the image of Peter huddled in that corner, terrified of the horrors his mind was creating. How long had he been hiding there, alone and afraid? How had our system failed him so badly that he felt safer breaking back into a psychiatric hospital than seeking help through proper channels? As I drove home, utterly exhausted, I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Peter's face, sometimes contorted with rage, sometimes blank with confusion, sometimes etched with a sadness so profound it made my heart ache. I've worked many nights at Oakwood since then. Security has been tightened, protocols revised. But I'll never forget that night, or the lessons it taught me about the complexities of mental illness and the very real dangers that can lurk in the shadows of a place meant to heal. Most of all, I'll never forget Peter. I often wonder where he is now, if he's getting the help he so desperately needs. In this line of work, we're taught to maintain professional distance, but sometimes a patient gets under your skin, reminding you of the very real, very human struggles behind the diagnoses and chart notes. Every night when I walk those quiet halls, I say a silent prayer for Peter, for all our patients past and present, and for myself, that we might find peace, healing, and a way out of the darkness that sometimes threatens to consume us all. That struck me as strange right away. The 42nd floor had been abandoned for months due to renovations. It should have been completely dark up there with no active connections whatsoever. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to head up and take a look. As the elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor, I was hit by a wall of stale air. The place was pitch black except for the glow of my tablet. I fumbled for my flashlight and flicked it on, revealing bare concrete floors and plastic sheeting covering half-finished walls. Everything was coated in a thin layer of construction dust. I made my way through the maze-like floor, following the signal on my tablet. As I got closer to the source, I started hearing faint voices and seeing a dim light coming from around a corner. My heart began to race. Who could be up here at this hour? I crept closer, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Peering around the corner, I saw a group of people huddled around a makeshift workstation of folding tables and laptops. They were talking in hushed tones, but I could make out bits and pieces. Firewall should be down in 10 minutes. Access to their entire system. Billions in cryptocurrency. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was witnessing. A team of hackers preparing for a massive cyber attack. From the equipment I could see, this was no amateur operation. These guys were pros, and they were about to hit someone big. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen in place. If they caught me, who knows what they'd do. But I couldn't just walk away and let this happen. I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing thoughts. Slowly, I edged back around the corner and retreated down the hallway. Once I was far enough away, I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. Who do I even call for something like this? The police? The FBI? I decided to start with building security. I dialed the main desk and whispered frantically to the night guard on duty. At first he thought I was pranking him, but as I described what I'd seen, the gravity of the situation sank in. He told me he was calling the police immediately and to get myself to safety. I made my way to the elevator, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. What if the hackers had seen me? What if they were coming after me right now? The ride down to the lobby felt like it took hours. When the doors finally opened, I was greeted by a swarm of police officers. They ushered me to a side room where I gave my statement, describing everything I'd seen in as much detail as I could remember. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I was starting to shake uncontrollably. After what felt like an eternity of questions, one of the officers came in and told me they'd apprehended the hackers. Apparently, they'd been so focused on their attack that they didn't even notice the police until it was too late. They'd managed to catch them red-handed, with all their equipment and plans laid out. As the night wore on, more details emerged. The hackers had been targeting Globe Corp, one of the largest tech companies in the world. If successful, their attack would have crippled Globe Corp's systems and potentially stolen billions in assets and sensitive data. And I'd stumbled right into the middle of it all. The next few days were a blur of more police interviews, statements to the press, and messages from friends and family who'd seen me on the news. Globe Corp even reached out to thank me personally and offer me a job in their cybersecurity division. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Looking back on that night, I still can't believe how close it all came to disaster. If I hadn't noticed that little network anomaly, if I hadn't decided to check it out, who knows what could have happened. It's terrifying to think about how vulnerable we all are to these kinds of digital threats. I've since taken that job with Globe Corp, dedicating myself to stopping attacks like the one I witnessed. Every day, I'm reminded of how important it is to stay vigilant in our increasingly connected world. You never know when you might be the one standing between cyber criminals and their next big score. The experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I have trouble sleeping some nights, plagued by what-if scenarios and phantom noises that make me think the hackers have come back for revenge. I'm more cautious now, always looking over my shoulder and double-checking security protocols. But I also feel a sense of purpose I never had before. I know firsthand how devastating these attacks can be, and I'm determined to do everything I can to prevent them. It's a constant battle against an ever-evolving threat, but one that needs to be fought. Sometimes I still think about that night on the 42nd floor, the eerie silence, the glow of computer screens in the darkness, the moment of realization when I understood what I was seeing. It's a memory that will stay with me forever, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary night can turn into something extraordinary. I often wonder about the hackers themselves. Who were they? How long had they been planning this attack? What drove them to risk everything for this score? I'll probably never know the answers, but the questions linger. In the end, I'm just grateful I was in the right place at the right time. It's a sobering thought that our entire digital infrastructure, our money, our data, our very identities, can be so vulnerable. We rely on technology for almost everything these days, but that reliance comes with risks we're only beginning to understand. So the next time you're online, remember my story. Be careful what you click on, what information you share, and who you trust. Because in this interconnected world we've built, the next big threat could be just a keystroke away. And you never know when you might find yourself on the front lines of the next cyber war. Around 2 a.m., I was making my usual rounds when suddenly all the lights went out. The emergency backup generators should have kicked in immediately, but for some reason, they didn't. I fumbled for my flashlight in the pitch-black darkness, my heart already starting to race. This wasn't normal. As soon as I got the flashlight on, I headed straight for the main control room to check the systems. That's when I heard it. Muffled voices and the sound of a door being forced open somewhere in the building. My blood ran cold. We were in the middle of nowhere. There shouldn't be anyone else here. I crept as quietly as I could toward the source of the noise, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight. As I rounded a corner, I caught a glimpse of several dark figures entering through a side door. They were dressed all in black, faces obscured. This was no accident. We were being invaded. Panic gripped me as I realized the full gravity of the situation. This facility housed incredibly sensitive data for major corporations and even some government agencies. If these intruders managed to access the servers, the consequences could be catastrophic. I knew I had to act fast. My first instinct was to confront them, but I quickly realized how outnumbered I was. There were at least 5 or 6 of them that I could see. I'm a pretty big guy, but I'm not stupid. I knew I didn't stand a chance against a group like that, especially if they were armed. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. As quietly but quickly as possible, I made my way to the security office. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I grabbed the emergency phone, a secure landline not connected to the main power grid. I called 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She assured me help was on the way, but the nearest officers were at least 20 minutes out. I didn't know if we had that kind of time. After hanging up, I pulled up the security camera feeds on the backup system. My heart sank as I watched the intruders methodically making their way through the facility. They clearly knew exactly where they were going, heading straight for the most critical server rooms. I felt utterly helpless as I watched them start attaching devices to the servers. I'm not an IT guy, but I knew enough to realize they were likely trying to download massive amounts of data or possibly plant some kind of malware. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly as I waited for help to arrive. I kept expecting the intruders to realize I was here and come looking for me. Every tiny sound made me jump. I've never felt fear like that before, the kind that makes your whole body tremble and your mouth go dry. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard sirens in the distance. Relief flooded through me, but I knew we weren't out of the woods yet. I used the security system to open the main gates, allowing the police cars to stream into the parking lot. I directed the officers to the intruder's location through the phone system. What followed was something straight out of an action movie. Shouts of "Police, freeze!" the sound of running feet, a brief exchange of gunfire. When it was finally over, the police had managed to apprehend all 6 intruders. As they were led out in handcuffs, I got my first good look at them. They were a diverse group, different ages, ethnicities. They didn't look like stereotypical criminals. If anything, they reminded me more of office workers or IT professionals. The following days were a whirlwind of questioning. Police, FBI, Homeland Security. I must have recounted my story a dozen times. Gradually, more details came to light. The group had somehow obtained detailed inside knowledge of the facility's systems and security measures. They had specifically timed their attack to coincide with a planned maintenance operation on the backup generators. Their goal, as I had feared, was to steal massive amounts of sensitive data and implant undetectable malware that would have given them ongoing access to the systems. If they had succeeded, it would have compromised the data of millions of people and potentially even threatened national security. I was hailed as a hero for my quick thinking in calling for help. The company even gave me a sizable bonus. But honestly, I didn't feel like a hero. For weeks afterwards, I had trouble sleeping. I kept reliving those terrifying moments in the dark, wondering what might have happened if I had made one wrong move. It's been almost a year now, and I still work at the same facility. Security has been massively overhauled, of course, but I don't think I'll ever feel quite as safe as I did before. Every time the lights flicker or I hear an unexpected noise, I find myself right back in that moment of panic. This experience taught me just how vulnerable our digital infrastructure can be. We trust these systems with our most sensitive information, but they're not invincible. It only takes one weak link, one moment of complacency, for everything to be put at risk. I'm more vigilant now than ever before. Every shift, I double and triple check every security measure. Some might call it paranoia, but I call it necessary caution, because I know firsthand just how quickly things can go wrong and how much is at stake if they do. I often find myself wondering about those intruders. Who were they really working for? How did they get their inside information? Were they just the tip of the iceberg? These questions keep me up at night sometimes. The world we live in is more interconnected than ever before, and that brings incredible benefits. But it also brings new vulnerabilities. My experience that night opened my eyes to just how fragile the systems we depend on can be. It's a reality I think everyone should be aware of, so I guess that's why I'm sharing my story. As a warning, yes, but also as a call to vigilance. Whether you work in cybersecurity or just use a smartphone, we all have a role to play in protecting our digital world, because you never know when you might find yourself being the last line of defense against those who would do us harm. That night changed me forever. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the threats that lurk in the shadows of our interconnected world. But I'm also more appreciative of the people who work tirelessly to keep us safe. The police officers who came to my rescue, the cybersecurity experts who work to thwart attacks before they happen. In the end, I suppose I'm grateful for the experience, harrowing as it was. It gave me a new perspective, a new purpose. And if sharing my story can help even one person or organization better protect themselves, then some good will have come from that terrifying night. So to anyone reading this, I urge you, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never underestimate the importance of security. Because you never know when you might find yourself face to face with a threat you never saw coming. And in that moment, your actions could make all the difference. My heart started racing as I crept towards the source of the noise. Peering around a shelf, I saw a hooded figure hunched over the locked cabinet where we keep the most tightly controlled medications. He was using some kind of tool to try to pry open the cabinet door. For a split second, I froze in panic. Should I call the police? Hide and wait for him to leave? But then a surge of anger washed over me. How dare this lowlife try to steal from our pharmacy? These weren't just any drugs. They were life-saving medications that our patients depended on. Without really thinking it through, I grabbed a heavy plastic pill counting tray from the counter and shouted, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The thief's head whipped around, his eyes wide with shock behind the ski mask covering his face. He lunged at me, trying to shove past to escape, but adrenaline was coursing through my veins now. I swung the tray and caught him in the shoulder, making him stumble. He recovered quickly, though, and threw a wild punch that glanced off my jaw. Pain exploded across my face, but I managed to dodge his next swing. We grappled awkwardly, knocking over displays as we struggled. He was bigger than me, but I had the advantage of knowing the store layout. I managed to slam him into the edge of the counter, knocking the wind out of him. But he grabbed a handful of my hair and yanked hard, making me cry out. Desperately, I jabbed my elbow back and felt it connect solidly with his ribs. The thief let out a pained grunt and his grip loosened. I spun around and shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled backwards and tripped over a fallen shelf, crashing to the ground. Before he could get up, I grabbed a large bottle of liquid antacid and smashed it over his head. The plastic bottle didn't break, but the impact was enough to stun him. I quickly grabbed some zip ties we use for bundling and managed to restrain his hands behind his back. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Only then did I grab the phone and call 911, my voice trembling as I reported the break-in. The operator assured me police were on the way. I slumped against the wall, every muscle aching, as the reality of what just happened washed over me. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police arrived and took the thief into custody. They praised me for my bravery, but also gently scolded me for putting myself at risk. Paramedics checked us both out. I had some bruises and a split lip, but nothing serious. The store owner arrived, shocked by the mess, but grateful I had prevented a major theft. As things calmed down, one of the detectives pulled me aside. "We've been investigating a string of pharmacy robberies in the area," he told me. "We think this guy may be connected to a larger operation selling stolen meds on the street. Your actions tonight may have just helped us crack a major case." I felt a mix of pride and lingering fear as I gave my official statement. When I was finally allowed to go home as the sun was rising, I was utterly exhausted. But I also felt a newfound sense of purpose. I had always seen my job as just dispensing medications. Now I realized we were on the front lines of keeping these powerful drugs out of the wrong hands. In the weeks that followed, more details emerged about the drug ring the thief was part of. They had been stealing medications from pharmacies across 3 states and selling them illegally. The incident at our store had given police the break they needed to bring down the whole operation. I received a commendation from the police department and a bonus from my boss. But more importantly, I gained a deeper appreciation for the responsibility we hold as pharmacy workers. It's not just about filling prescriptions. We play a crucial role in protecting public health and safety. The experience changed me in other ways, too. I signed up for self-defense classes and became more vigilant about security procedures at work. I also got involved with a community program to educate people about prescription drug abuse. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night. The sound of breaking glass makes me jump. But mostly, I feel proud that I was able to make a difference. One person standing up to do the right thing, even at personal risk, can have a big impact. I know confronting the thief directly was dangerous. If I could do it over, I'd probably just call the police right away. But in that moment, all I could think about was protecting our patients and our pharmacy. I'm just grateful it turned out okay in the end. Now when I work the night shift, I'm extra alert. Every sound makes me tense up a bit, but I also feel a sense of purpose, knowing I'm not just dispensing medications. I'm helping keep our community safe. It's a responsibility I take seriously. I never expected to be involved in taking down a drug trafficking ring, but life has a way of putting us in unexpected situations. All we can do is try to rise to the challenge and do what's right. That night taught me that ordinary people can make a real difference in fighting crime and protecting their community. It's a lesson I'll never forget. I had set out early that morning to patrol a more remote section of the park. It was a crisp autumn day, with a slight chill in the air and the trees just starting to show hints of gold and red. As I hiked along one of the lesser-used trails, I was keeping an eye out for any signs of wildlife or potential hazards. Little did I know, the real danger lurking in the forest that day wasn't from bears or mountain lions, but from a group of ruthless poachers. It was around mid-morning when I first sensed that something wasn't quite right. The forest had gone eerily quiet, no bird calls, no rustling in the underbrush. My instincts were on high alert as I carefully made my way forward, scanning the trees and listening intently. That's when I heard it. Voices speaking in low, hushed tones somewhere up ahead. I crouched down and crept closer, my heart pounding. As I peered through a gap in the foliage, I saw them. A group of 5 men, dressed in camouflage and carrying high-powered rifles. They were huddled around a map, pointing and discussing something in urgent whispers. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was witnessing. These were poachers, getting ready to illegally hunt some of the park's protected wildlife. For a moment, I was frozen with indecision. I knew I needed to act fast to stop them, but I was alone and seriously outgunned. These guys looked like hardened criminals, not your average careless hunters. If I confronted them directly, there was a very real chance things could turn violent. But I also knew I couldn't just stand by and let them slaughter innocent animals. It went against everything I believed in and had dedicated my life to as a ranger. I had to do something, even if it meant putting myself at risk. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio to call for backup, but just as I was about to hit the call button, a twig snapped under my foot. The noise seemed deafening in the quiet forest. All 5 heads snapped up and turned in my direction. I held my breath, praying they hadn't spotted me. For a few agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Then one of the men gestured sharply, and they all raised their weapons, peering intently into the trees. "Who's there?" one of them called out gruffly. "Show yourself." My mind raced. I knew if I revealed myself now, I'd be at their mercy. But if I tried to sneak away, they'd likely hear me and open fire. I was trapped. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I stood up slowly with my hands raised. "National Park Service," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm going to have to ask you gentlemen to lower your weapons and come with me." They exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. 5 against 1 in a remote part of the forest where gunshots might go unnoticed. My pulse was racing as I waited to see what they'd do. Finally, the apparent leader of the group stepped forward. He was a burly man with a scarred face and cold eyes. Now, Ranger," he said with a cruel smile. "I think you might want to reconsider that request. You see, we've got some business to attend to out here, and we can't have you interfering." "The only business happening here is you all being arrested for poaching," I retorted, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "This is your last warning. Put down the weapons and surrender peacefully." The man's smile vanished, replaced by a look of menace. "Wrong answer," he snarled. In one fluid motion, he raised his rifle and pointed it straight at my chest. Time seemed to slow down. I saw his finger tightening on the trigger. In that moment, all my training kicked in. I dove to the side just as the gun went off, the bullet whizzing past where I'd been standing a split second before. I rolled behind a large tree trunk, heart pounding in my ears. More shots rang out, splintering bark all around me. I knew I had only seconds before they rushed my position. Fumbling with my radio, I managed to hit the emergency distress signal. It would alert the nearest ranger stations that an officer was in danger, but help would still be at least 20 minutes away. I had to find a way to survive until then. Taking a deep breath, I unholstered my own sidearm. I hated the idea of using lethal force, but at this point it was kill or be killed. These men had made it clear they wouldn't be taken alive. "Last chance," I shouted. "Throw down your weapons or I'll be forced to fire." The only response was another hail of bullets. I peeked out from behind the tree and squeezed off 2 quick shots in their direction, more to keep them at bay than with any real hope of hitting them. For the next several minutes, it was like being in a war zone. Gunfire echoed through the forest as we exchanged shots. I kept having to move from tree to tree as they tried to flank me. My ranger training had never prepared me for anything like this. I managed to wing one of them in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back with a cry of pain. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they overwhelmed me. I was down to my last few bullets, and they still had me outnumbered 4-1. Just when I thought it was all over, I heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. The cavalry had arrived. The poachers heard it too. Their leader let out a string of curses. "Fall back," he yelled to his men. "Into the trees! Move it!" I wanted to pursue them, but I knew it would be suicide to leave my cover. Instead, I kept my weapon trained in their direction as I heard them crashing through the underbrush, fleeing deeper into the forest. Moments later, 3 patrol vehicles came roaring up the nearby service road, loaded with armed rangers. They fanned out into the woods, securing the area. I sagged against a tree in relief, the adrenaline leaving my system all at once. "John, you all right?" It was my supervisor, Tom, jogging over with a look of concern. I nodded wearily. "Yeah, I'm okay, but those bastards got away into the woods. We need to set up a perimeter fast." Tom clasped my shoulder. "Don't worry. We've got park police and state troopers on the way. They won't get far. You did good, John. Real good." Over the next few hours, a massive manhunt unfolded throughout the park. Roadblocks were set up at all exits, and search teams combed the forest with dogs. By nightfall, all 5 poachers had been apprehended trying to sneak out through a backcountry trail. We found their camp and seized an arsenal of illegal weapons, along with detailed maps showing prime hunting grounds for some of the park's most endangered species. If I hadn't stumbled upon them when I did, who knows how many innocent animals might have been slaughtered. In the days since, I've had a lot of time to reflect on what happened. People have called me a hero, but I don't feel like one. I was just doing my job, protecting the land and creatures I've sworn to serve. But I'd be lying if I said it hasn't affected me. Every snapping twig makes me jump now when I'm out on patrol. I find myself constantly scanning the trees, wondering if another threat is lurking just out of sight. The forest that once felt like home now seems full of shadows and hidden dangers. But I won't let fear stop me from doing what I love. This park, and all the magnificent creatures that call it home, are worth protecting. And as long as I'm able, I'll be out here standing guard, come what may. I just hope I never have another day quite like that one. Once was more than enough for a lifetime. That night started like any other. I made my rounds, checking on patients and helping those who needed assistance. Around 2 a.m., I was heading to the supply closet to restock some items when I heard a strange noise coming from the medication room. My first thought was that maybe one of the residents had wandered out of bed, confused and looking for help. It wouldn't be the first time. But as I approached, I saw that the door was slightly ajar, which was definitely not normal. We always kept that room securely locked. Heart pounding, I peered through the crack in the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man inside, methodically going through the cabinets and stuffing bottles of medication into a backpack. He was dressed in dark clothes and wearing gloves, clearly not a resident or staff member. For a split second, I froze. This was way beyond anything I'd dealt with before. But then training kicked in, and I knew I had to act fast to protect our vulnerable patients. I burst through the door shouting, "Hey, What do you think you're doing?" The man whirled around, startled. He was younger than I expected, probably in his late 20s, with wild eyes that darted around like a cornered animal. "Get out of here now," I yelled, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm calling the police." He bolted past me, shoving me hard against the wall as he ran. I stumbled, but managed to stay on my feet and take off after him. My heart was racing as I chased him down the hallway, past closed doors where our residents slept, unaware of the drama unfolding. The thief was fast, but I was determined not to let him get away. We thundered down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the stairwell. I could hear his ragged breathing just ahead of me. As we burst out into the parking lot, I realized with sinking dread that I was losing ground. He was heading for a car parked near the exit. I put on a final burst of speed, lungs burning, but it wasn't enough. He jumped into the driver's seat and peeled out of the lot with squealing tires just as I reached the vehicle. Gasping for breath, I memorized the license plate and make of the car as it sped away into the night. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call 911. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and checking on our residents. Thankfully, it seemed the thief hadn't harmed anyone, but the violation of our patients' safety left me rattled. As I gave my statement to the officers, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a random burglary. The thief had known exactly where to find the most valuable medications. He must have had inside knowledge of our facility. The police praised me for my quick thinking in chasing the suspect and getting a description of the vehicle. They told me they'd been investigating a string of similar thefts at nursing homes across the county. My report could be the break they needed to crack the case. Over the next few days, security at Oakwood was tightened. New locks were installed, and we implemented stricter protocols for accessing medications. I found myself jumping at shadows, checking and double-checking doors obsessively. A week after the incident, I got a call from the detective working the case. They'd made an arrest based on the information I'd provided. The thief turned out to be a former pharmacy tech who'd been fired for stealing. He'd been targeting nursing homes, selling the stolen meds on the black market. I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. We'd caught the guy, but the incident had shattered my sense of security. I couldn't shake the image of that man rifling through our medication cabinets, taking advantage of helpless elderly patients. The experience changed me. I became hypervigilant, always on the lookout for anything out of place. Some of my coworkers teased me for being paranoid, but I didn't care. I'd seen firsthand how vulnerable our residents were, and I was determined to protect them. Months passed, and life at Oakwood slowly returned to normal. But every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye or hear an unexpected noise, and my heart would race. The memory of that night was etched into my mind. One evening, I was helping Mrs. Johnson, one of our longtime residents, get ready for bed. As I adjusted her pillows, she patted my hand and said, "You know, dear, I've noticed how careful you always are, checking everything, watching out for us. It makes an old lady feel safe." I swallowed hard, touched by her words. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Johnson," I replied. She shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You really care. Not everyone does, you know. We can tell the difference." As I finished tucking her in and turned out the light, I realized that Mrs. Johnson was right. The incident with the thief had shaken me, but it had also reinforced why I'd chosen this work in the first place. These weren't just patients. They were people who deserved dignity, respect, and protection in their twilight years. From that day on, I carried my heightened awareness not as a burden, but as a badge of honor. Yes, there were people out there who would prey on the vulnerable. But there were also people like me, standing guard, ready to do whatever it took to keep them safe. The world can be a scary place, especially for those who can't defend themselves. But as long as there are people willing to stand up and do the right thing, there's hope. That night in the medication room taught me that sometimes being brave means being the only thing standing between the darkness and those who need protection. I still work at Oakwood, still make my rounds with watchful eyes, and every time I check a lock or escort a resident safely to their room, I remember why I'm here. Not just as an orderly, but as a guardian for those who need it most. I heard the bell chime as the door swung open. 4 guys sauntered in, laughing and shoving each other. They looked to be in their mid-20s, wearing baggy jeans and hoodies. Something about their body language set me on edge immediately. They were loud, aggressive, clearly drunk or high on something. I kept my head down, pretending to be absorbed in organizing the shelves, but I watched them out of the corner of my eye as they made their way to the beer cooler. One of them knocked over a display of chips, scattering bags across the floor. Another one laughed and kicked the bags further down the aisle. "Hey man, you gotta clean that up," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The biggest guy in the group turned and glared at me. "What did you say?" he growled, taking a step in my direction. I felt my heart rate kick up a notch. "Nothing, never mind," I mumbled, turning back to the shelves. I heard them snickering behind me. Just then, the door chimed again. An elderly couple walked in, holding hands. The woman's eyes widened as she took in the scene, potato chips strewn everywhere, 4 intimidating guys looming by the beer. I saw her tug on her husband's sleeve, trying to pull him back towards the door. But it was too late. "Well, looky here, boys. We got ourselves some action," one of the guys called out. They started wolf whistling and making crude comments as they surrounded the couple. "How about a dance, Grandma?" the ringleader leered, reaching for the woman's arm. She let out a frightened squeak and shrank back against her husband. I knew I had to do something. My hands were shaking as I reached for my cell phone, tucking it under the counter to dial 911. I whispered the situation to the dispatcher as quickly and quietly as I could. "Please hurry," I breathed before hanging up. Now I just had to keep things under control until help arrived. I stepped out from behind the counter, heart pounding. "Hey guys, why don't you leave them alone and just buy your beer?" I suggested, trying to sound casual. The leader rounded on me, getting right up in my face. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You got a problem?" he snarled. I held up my hands. "No problem here, just trying to keep things cool, that's all." He grabbed a fistful of my shirt, yanking me closer. "Maybe you need to mind your own fucking business," he hissed. I struggled to stay calm, knowing I needed to de-escalate the situation. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. How about I give you guys the beer for free if you just chill out?" For a moment I thought it had worked. The guy loosened his grip on my shirt slightly, but then one of his buddies piped up, "Nah, fuck that. Let's trash this place." And just like that, all hell broke loose. They started knocking items off the shelves, smashing bottles, whooping and hollering like wild animals. The elderly couple cowered in a corner as glass and debris flew everywhere. I ducked behind the counter, heart racing. Where were the cops? How long had it been? It felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I peeked out to see the ringleader heading towards the couple again with a predatory grin. Without thinking, I grabbed the baseball bat we kept under the register for protection. I vaulted over the counter, bat raised. "Back off!" I yelled, surprising myself with how forceful I sounded. The guy whirled around, eyes narrowing as he saw the bat. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me. But then we all heard it, the blessed sound of police sirens approaching. The gang's demeanor changed instantly. They started scrambling for the door, shoving each other out of the way in their haste to escape. But it was too late. 3 police cruisers screeched into the parking lot, lights flashing. The next few minutes were a blur. Cops swarmed in, cuffing the troublemakers and taking statements. An ambulance arrived to check on the elderly couple, who were shaken but thankfully unharmed. As things calmed down, one of the officers approached me. "You did good, son," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Kept your cool and protected those folks. Not everyone would have had the guts to stand up to those thugs." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, my legs suddenly wobbly as the adrenaline wore off. I sank down onto a stool, surveying the destruction around me. Broken glass glittered on the floor, shelves overturned, merchandise scattered everywhere. It was going to be a long night of cleanup. But as I watched the police lead the gang away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of pride cut through the exhaustion. I'd faced my fears and done the right thing. And who knows, maybe I'd saved those nice old folks from something even worse. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon as I finished mopping up the last of the mess. My boss had come in to relieve me, insisting I go home and get some rest. As I walked to my car, I paused to take a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The events of the night felt almost surreal in the soft light of dawn. Had it really happened? The aches in my muscles and the lingering tremor in my hands confirmed that it had. I knew I'd be replaying those intense moments in my mind for a long time to come. But I also knew I'd learned something about myself. When push came to shove, I'd found a strength I didn't know I had, and that knowledge gave me a sense of confidence I'd never felt before. As I drove home, the weight of the night's events settled over me. I realized how differently things could have gone if I hadn't kept my cool or if the police hadn't arrived when they did. The what-ifs were almost overwhelming. I thought about quitting, about finding a nice, safe day job where I wouldn't have to deal with situations like this. But then I remembered the grateful looks on the elderly couple's faces, the pride in the officer's voice when he commended me. Maybe this was where I was meant to be, doing my small part to keep my community safe. I pulled into my driveway just as my neighbor was leaving for work. She waved cheerily, completely unaware of the night I'd had. It struck me then how many stories like mine go untold, how many everyday heroes walk among us unrecognized. As I finally crawled into bed, exhausted but oddly exhilarated, I made a decision. I would go back to work tomorrow night, and the night after that. Because sometimes being brave means simply showing up and doing your job, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. I drifted off to sleep, the memory of those intense moments already beginning to fade like a strange dream. But the lessons I'd learned about courage, about community, about myself, those would stay with me forever. It was just another ordinary night shift at WKRX. As the overnight DJ, I'm used to the quiet, empty studio and the occasional call from an insomniac listener. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened. Around 2 a.m., I got a call that seemed normal enough at first. A guy requesting a song, chatting a bit, but then he started describing things in the studio, the color of my coffee mug, the band poster on the wall behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine. How could he know those details? I tried to brush it off, told myself I was being paranoid. But then he called again, 20 minutes later. This time, he described what I was wearing, right down to the logo on my t-shirt that wasn't visible on the studio webcam. My hands were shaking, as I put him on hold and frantically looked around the studio, checking the windows, the doors. But I was alone. The calls kept coming, every 15-20 minutes. Each time, he revealed some new detail that proved he was watching me somehow. The half-eaten granola bar on my desk, the schedule I'd scribbled on a post-it note. He even knew I'd just scratched my nose off air. I was in full panic mode by this point. I called my producer, but of course he didn't answer at 3 a.m. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? I had no proof, just a creepy caller who somehow knew things he shouldn't. I felt utterly alone and exposed. The next call chilled me to my core. In a low, menacing voice, he said, "I see you, Jake. I'm coming for you." Then he hung up. I was shaking uncontrollably now. I locked the studio door and huddled in the corner, away from the windows. But I still had to keep the show going. I couldn't just abandon the air. So I put on a long song and tried to pull myself together. That's when I heard it, a scratching sound at the studio door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, praying it would stop. But it continued, growing more insistent. Then I heard a key in the lock. In that moment, I've never felt more terror. I was trapped, cornered like an animal. As the door slowly creaked open, I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. But it was Roy, our overnight security guard. He'd heard noises and came to check on me. I broke down, sobbing with relief as I told him everything. Roy did a thorough search of the building but found nothing. No sign of any intruder. He called the police, who arrived quickly. They took my statement and searched again, but there was no evidence of anyone breaking in. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I gave my statement to the cops multiple times. They checked the phone logs, but of course the calls came from blocked numbers. They set up extra patrols around the station, but ultimately said there wasn't much they could do without more concrete evidence. I didn't sleep for days after that. I jumped at every sound, convinced he was coming for me. I took time off work, too scared to return to the station. When I finally did go back, they'd installed new security cameras and changed all the locks. But it didn't make me feel any safer. The strange thing is, after that night, the calls stopped completely. No more creepy messages, no more signs of being watched. It was like he vanished into thin air. In some ways, that's almost worse. The not knowing. Is he still out there, biding his time? Did he move on to a new victim? Or was it all some elaborate hoax? I've racked my brain trying to figure out how he knew those details about the studio. Hidden cameras? An inside job? But I've found no answers. The police investigation turned up nothing. It's been weeks now, and life has mostly returned to normal. But I'm not the same. I'm constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I've become paranoid about what I share on air, terrified of revealing any personal details. My friends and family try to reassure me, tell me it's over. But they don't understand. How can I ever feel safe again, knowing someone was watching me so closely? How do I trust that he's really gone? I love being a DJ, connecting with listeners. But now there's always that seed of fear. Who's really on the other end of the line? What do they want from me? I've thought about quitting, moving to a new city, starting over. But would that even help? Would he find me again? And I can't let him win, can't let him take away the job I love. So I keep going, night after night. But things will never be the same. The studio that once felt like a second home now feels like a fishbowl, exposed and vulnerable. Every shadow makes me flinch. Every phone call sets my heart racing. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to work through the trauma and anxiety. She says it will take time, that healing isn't linear. Some days are better than others. but I don't know if I'll ever fully recover, ever feel truly safe again. The worst part is the lingering questions. Who was he? How did he know those things? What did he want from me? I fear I'll never have answers. I've become obsessed with true crime stories, looking for similar cases, searching for clues. But nothing quite matches my experience. I scour online forums, hoping to find others who've been through something similar. But so far, I've found no answers, no closure. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if the stress and isolation of the night shift made me snap. But then I remember the terror in my gut, the absolute certainty that someone was watching me. It was real, too real. I try to take precautions now. I vary my routine, check in with friends regularly. I've installed a security system at home. But still, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the phone rings at the station, my heart stops for a moment. Will this be the call that starts it all over again? So far, it's just been normal listeners. But for how long? I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The experience has shaken me to my core, made me question everything I thought I knew about privacy and security. In this interconnected world, are any of us really safe? How well do we know who's on the other end of the line, watching from the shadows? All I can do is take it one day at a time, try to reclaim my life and my passion for radio. But I'll never forget that night, never stop looking over my shoulder, because somewhere out there, he might still be watching, waiting to strike again.